the microscopic kingdom of the undergown, the grand illusion of royalty began at the skin, but the skin was rarely ever clean by modern standards, as the prevailing medical theories of the Renaissance and Baroque periods suggested that water opened the pores to the miasma of disease, particularly the plague, leading queens and princesses to avoid full body immersion for months or even years at a time. This lack of bathing meant that the base layer of any royal ensemble, the chemise or smock, became a literal sponge for the natural oils, dead skin cells, and perspiration produced by a body trapped under pounds of heavy fabric, creating a moist, dark ecosystem that thrived in the warmth of the palace. Because the outer gowns were constructed from stiff silks, heavy velvets, and metallic threads that could not be laundered, the cleaning process was merely a superficial brushing or the application of white vinegar to the underarms, leaving the core of the garment to ferment with the history of the wearer's biology. These gowns were often inherited or gifted, meaning a lady in waiting might be wearing the dried sweat and skin flora of a queen who had died decades prior, all hidden beneath a facade of pearls and gold leaf. The sheer weight of these garments, sometimes exceeding 40 or 50 pounds, caused the wearer to perspire constantly, even in winter. Yet the layers of stays and petticoats acted as an airtight seal, preventing any evaporation and turning the space between the body and the corset into a breeding ground for bacterial colonies that would cause chronic fungal infections and courtly rashes that were simply accepted as a part of noble life. In the absence of deodorant, the aristocratic solution was the pomander, a perforated metal ball filled with spices like cinnamon, cloves, and musk, which the women would hold to their noses to mask not only the smell of their own bodies, but the stench of the palace itself, which was often a cocktail of open sewers and rotting rushes on the floor. Within the deep folds of the farthingale, the structured hoop skirt, the lack of airflow was so total that the fabric would become damp with humidity, attracting parasites like the Pulex irritans or the human flea, which found the velvet and fur linings of royal robes to be the perfect sanctuary. Ladies would wear flea furs or zibellini, the preserved skins of martens or sables, around their necks or hanging from their belts, hoping the insects would be more attracted to the animal fur than their own skin, though this rarely worked, leaving the most powerful women in the world constantly covered in red, itchy welts that they had to ignore while maintaining a stoic, regal expression during hours of public ritual. The hygiene of the time also lacked any concept of menstrual products as we know them. Royal women often used rags or simply allowed the many layers of their heavy, dark-colored petticoats to absorb the flow, leading to a buildup of dried blood within the lower structures of the gown that contributed to a metallic, sour odor that mingled with the heavy perfumes of the court. As the day progressed and the candles in the ballroom increased the temperature, the scent of hundreds of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and old blood would rise in a thick cloud. Yet the social decorum of the time dictated that no one acknowledge the invisible filth, focusing instead on the dazzling light reflecting off the diamonds sewn into the bodices. The structural elements of the gowns, such as the busks made of wood, whalebone, or ivory, would rub against the skin until it bled, and because the gowns were never truly cleaned, these small wounds often became infected, leading to localized sepsis that royal physicians would treat with even more filth, such as poultices made of animal dung or moldy bread. The very fabric of the dresses was often a source of toxicity, as dyes were frequently stabilized with urine or arsenic, meaning the royal woman was essentially wrapped in a poisonous, parasitic cocoon that slowly eroded her health while she stood as a symbol of divine perfection. This paradox of the Golden Age meant that while a queen might control an empire, she could not control the lice crawling through her wig or the fungus spreading beneath her corset, as the technology of fashion had far outpaced the technology of hygiene, creating a world where the more beautiful a woman appeared, the more hidden filth she was likely concealing within the dark, airless caverns of her magnificent attire. The logistical nightmare of royal waste management and the internal mechanical destruction caused by the core or stays of the 17th and 18th centuries formed a hidden reality of anatomical suffering that no oil painting could ever capture, as the silhouette of the perfect woman was achieved through a violent compression of the soft tissues and vital organs that essentially relocated the liver, stomach, and intestines into a cramped, unnatural space within the lower pelvic cavity. Because the gowns were constructed to be virtually impenetrable, with rows of lacing that could take a team of servants over an hour to tighten, the simple act of digestion became a painful, slow process that often led to chronic constipation and a buildup of internal toxins, which in turn caused the sallow, grayish complexion that the women then tried to mask with even more lead-based powders. In the drafty, sprawling palaces like Versailles, where the distance from a ballroom to the nearest cabinet de toilette could be a quarter-mile trek through freezing galleries, the physical impossibility of disrobing meant that royal women had to develop a mastery over their own biology that would seem superhuman today, or else succumb to the indignity of their own finery. The invention of the bordeleau, a gravy boat shaped ceramic vessel named after a Jesuit priest whose sermons were so long that noblewomen had to relieve themselves mid service, became the secret companion of the high-born lady tucked into the voluminous folds of her silk skirts or held by a trusted maid while the woman stood perfectly still, her heavy brocade acting as a temporary curtain of privacy in a crowded room. However, the lack of modern undergarments meant that drawers were non existent. Women wore open crotch chemises or nothing at all beneath their many layers of petticoats, allowing for the discreet use of these vessels, but also ensuring that any accidental spill or leakage would be absorbed into the structural buckram and horsehair of the skirt's framing, where it would dry and remain for the duration of the season. This hidden dampness, combined with the extreme heat generated by dozens of layers of wool and silk, created a permanent state of garment fermentation, where the acidic nature of human waste would slowly eat away at the internal linings of the dress, causing the structural bones made of actual whale baleen to soften and warp over time. The pressure on the bladder from the downward force of the corset meant that many royal women suffered from permanent urinary tract infections and kidney stones, conditions that were exacerbated by the fact that they often avoided drinking water to minimize the need to use the pot, leading to chronic dehydration and a thick, concentrated body chemistry that made their breath and skin smell of ammonia. Beyond the biological filth, the gowns themselves were repositories for the environment. The long trains of the dresses, which symbolized the woman's rank by their sheer length, acted as massive dust mops for the palace floors, which were frequently covered in a layer of old straw, animal droppings from court hunting dogs, and the discarded scraps of food from banquets. As the queen walked, her train would gather this palace sludge, dragging it back into her private chambers, where it would fester in the dark corners of her wardrobe, attracting rodents that would sometimes nest within the structural cages of the panniers, or wide-hooped frames. These frames, made of bent willow or cane, were so vast that a woman could not sit in a standard chair or pass through a door sideways, creating a physical barrier that trapped her in a mobile environment of her own making, a microclimate of stale air, rising heat, and the slow decay of organic matter trapped in the weave of the fabric. The fainting fits, so commonly associated with historical ladies, were rarely the result of delicate emotions. They were the direct physiological consequence of total lung capacity being reduced by up to 30%, leading to a state of chronic hypoxia where the brain was constantly starved of oxygen, while the heart had to pump twice as hard to move blood through a torso that was being crushed by a rigid cage of steel and bone. This internal filth, the backup of the digestive system, the infection of the urinary tract, and the oxygen-starved blood, was the true price of the regal look, creating a walking paradox where the most powerful women on earth were physically decomposing from the inside out, held together only by the very silk and wire that was killing them.
The toxic Silk Road and the parasitic luxury in the 13th and 14th centuries. The hidden filth of the royal woman underwent a transformation as the Silk Road brought not just beauty, but a lethal cocktail of foreign pathogens and merchant's grime. When a bolt of silk arrived from the east to be fashioned into a queen's surcoat, it carried with it the history of every hand that had touched it, from the silkworm harvesters in Asia to the desert caravans in the Levant. Because silk was precious, it was never washed in the traditional sense. Instead, it was treated with alum and stale urine to set the exotic dyes. This meant that the royal woman was wearing a fabric that was chemically unstable and biologically active. The dyes themselves, such as Tyrian purple or Kermes red, were produced through the fermentation of thousands of crushed mollusks or insects, creating a base layer of organic rot that was permanently bonded to the fibers. As the queen's body heat warmed the silk, the fabric would release the scent of marine decay, which the court attempted to hide with heavy applications of frankincense and myrrh. The biological filth of the Silk Road was even more insidious. The caravans that carried these luxury goods across the continents were also moving the Great Migration. Within the folds of the heavy velvets and raw silks, microscopic parasites and caravan fleas found a permanent home. Unlike the common European louse, these were exotic parasites that the royal immune system was unprepared for. When the queen put on her new, unwashed silk gown, these dormant insects would awaken in the warmth of her skin, leading to the silk fever, a chronic state of skin inflammation and weeping sores that were often blamed on bad humors or witchcraft. The royal woman's skin would become a landscape of red welts, which she would hide by layering more silk over the inflammation, creating an airtight incubation chamber where the bacteria could flourish. This was further complicated by the use of gold thread, which was actually silver wire dipped in mercury to give it a golden sheen. As the gold thread rubbed against the open sores caused by the parasites, the mercury would enter the bloodstream, causing tremors and the metallic madness that was so common among the high-born. The internal filth of this era was dominated by the exotic spice burden. Royal women, wanting to display their wealth, would consume food that was so heavily spiced with cloves, cinnamon, and pepper that it caused chronic spice gastritis, a permanent inflammation of the stomach lining. This led to a constant state of acidic fermentation within the gut, resulting in breath that smelled of rotting spices and old blood. Because the royal woman was often immobile in her heavy, layered silks, her lymphatic system would stagnate, leading to the gilded bloat, a swelling of the limbs and face that she would try to disguise with even more voluminous drapery. The boring history of the Silk Road reveals that the more global a queen's wardrobe became, the more toxic her internal environment became. Her gown was a map of the world's filth, a collection of organic rot from the sea, parasites from the desert, and heavy metals from the laboratory. She was a walking biohazard of international proportions, her divine presence a shimmering mask for a body that was being consumed by the very luxury she wore as a sign of her power. The Silk Road did not just bring wealth. It brought a new, invisible filth that turned the royal palace into a global crossroads of infection and chemical decay. The barber surgeons and the bird dung facial by the mid-1500s, the hidden filth of the royal woman, the lead, the sweat, and the parasitic bites had often reached a point of dermal saturation, where her skin began to slough off or turn a mottled, grayish yellow. To fix this, the Tudor barber surgeons were called in to perform a skin renovation. The most common treatment was the acidic stripping, where a mixture of sublimated sulfur and wine vinegar was applied to the face to burn off the top 3 layers of skin. As the skin blistered and peeled in the drafty palace chambers, the raw flesh underneath was exposed to the soot of the fireplaces and the bacteria of the unwashed linens. To suit this raw, weeping landscape, the surgeons would apply a healing paste made of pigeon droppings and honey. The ammonia in the bird dung acted as a bleaching agent, while the bacteria in the excrement introduced new, avian infections directly into the woman's open wounds, leading to the pallas pox, a chronic, weeping inflammation of the cheeks and forehead. While her face was being chemically scorched, her body was subjected to the humoral siphon. Because the royal gown was so restrictive, it was believed that bad blood would pool in the lower limbs, causing the gown edema we discussed earlier. The solution was the application of medicinal leeches to the inner thighs and ankles. These leeches, often gathered from the stagnant moats of the castle, were placed directly beneath the silk shift. As they gorged themselves on the royal blood, they would often regurgitate the bacteria from the sewage-filled moat into the woman's bloodstream, leading to localized sepsis and leech fever. The royal woman would have to stand perfectly still during court ceremonies while the leeches hung from her legs, their slimy bodies hidden by the heavy velvet of her skirts, while the hidden filth of the moat circulated through her veins. The internal filth was further managed through the Great Clyster. To combat the bowel stagnation caused by the corset, royal women were subjected to frequent internal washings using a silver or bone syringe. The liquid used was often a concoction of boiling herbs and rosewater, but the water was frequently drawn from the same lead-contaminated cisterns that fueled the kitchens. This meant that the cleansing process was actually a direct injection of lead and pathogens into the lower digestive tract. The boring history of this Tudor medical ritual reveals that the royal woman was in a constant state of biochemical flux. Her skin was being burned off by acid, her blood was being sucked by parasites, and her internal organs were being flushed with leaden water. She was a walking medical experiment, her divine beauty a fragile, temporary mask held together by bird dung and opium. The royal gown served as a mobile infirmary, concealing the bandages, the leeches, and the weeping sores of a woman who was being healed into an early grave by the most prestigious doctors in the land. The psychological and physical toll of the grand hair era added a literal weight to the hidden filth of royal women, as the transition from the gown to the scalp was marked by a seamless integration of organic decay and fashion-forward architectural Madness that reached its peak in the late 18th century with the poof. To achieve the gravity-defying heights required by the courts of Marie Antoinette or Catherine the Great, a woman's natural hair was pulled over a cushion or rat made of frizzed horsehair or wool, which was then saturated with a thick paste of animal lard and wheat flour to act as a structural adhesive. Because these towering masterpieces took several hours, and sometimes an entire day, to construct with the help of multiple stylists, they were designed to remain in place for weeks or even months at a time without being dismantled. This meant that the lard, under the heat of the sun or the hundreds of candles in a ballroom, would slowly turn rancid, emitting a sour, buttery stench that the royal women attempted to neutralize with heavy doses of lavender water and powdered orris root, creating a sickeningly sweet odor of decomposition. Within this warm, fatty environment, the flour served as an unintended banquet for the palace's permanent residents. Mice and silverfish were frequently discovered nesting deep within the internal scaffolding of the hair, lured by the scent of the wheat and the safety of the unmoving structure. At night, a royal woman could not sleep horizontally for fear of crushing the lard-based mold, so she would lean against a vertical bed or a stack of stiff wooden pillows, her head wrapped in a wire cage to prevent the mice from nibbling on her scalp while she drifted into a fitful, hypoxia-induced slumber. This lack of hygiene led to scalp scabies and chronic fungal crusting, where the skin of the head would become a weeping, inflamed landscape of sores that were never allowed to heal because the next application of lard and powder was always imminent. As the filth of the scalp migrated downward, it met the neck grime of the gown's high collar, which was often stiffened with lead-based starch that irritated the open sores, creating a continuous circuit of infection from the crown of the head to the base of the spine. The use of hair powder, which was essentially finely ground starch, was so prolific that it would drift down onto the shoulders of the dark velvet gowns like a permanent layer of toxic snow, mixing with the sweat of the neck to form a gray, cement-like sludge that would harden in the creases of the fabric. This sludge became a secondary home for the body louse, which, unlike the head louse, preferred to live in the seams of the clothing itself, only venturing onto the skin to feed on the royal blood before retreating back into the safety of the silk-lined stays. Because the gowns were never washed, these lice populations grew to biblical proportions, with their eggs or nits becoming permanently embedded in the embroidery and lace, making the very symbols of wealth the intricate gold threading the most infested parts of the garment. The women would use back scratchers made of carved ivory or silver, shaped like tiny hands, to reach beneath the layers of the gown and the heights of the hair to frantically itch at the crawling sensations. But this often led to skin abrasions that would then be exposed to the arsenic and lead dyes of the fabric, leading to localized poisoning and gown gangrene. The sheer absurdity of this existence meant that a princess might be wearing a miniature glass ship or a garden of silk flowers on her head, while underneath the lard and powder, her skin was crawling with vermin and her blood was heavy with heavy metals. This was the boring history of the elitist slow, stationary endurance of filth, where the body was treated as nothing more than a mannequin for a display of wealth that was quite literally rotting away in real time. The interaction between the rancid lard of the hair and the fermented urine of the gown created a specific, courtly aroma that defined the era. A scent that was so pervasive it was said a commoner could smell a royal procession coming from a mile away, long before the golden carriages were ever in sight. The downward migration of filth finally reached the foundation of the royal silhouette, where the feet and lower limbs were entombed in a microclimate of silk, lead-based leather, and stagnant moisture that turned the act of walking into a slow-motion medical catastrophe. Because the gowns were often so heavy and the stays so restrictive, the blood flow to the lower extremities was chronically compromised, leading to a condition known as gown edema, where the ankles would swell to twice their size, straining against the delicate, hand-knitted silk stockings that were almost never laundered. These stockings, held up by garters made of ribbon or even thin wire, acted as a secondary skin that absorbed the weeping sores caused by the friction of the heavy hems and the lack of systemic circulation. The shoes themselves were masterpieces of decorative cruelty. Made of silk or incredibly soft kid leather dyed with lead-saturated pigments, they featured Lewis heels that shifted the body's entire weight onto the balls of the feet, which were already softened by the constant dampness within the shoe. In the unheated, stone-floored palaces, the royal foot was trapped in a cycle of freezing and sweating, leading to a permanent state of chilblain necrosis where the skin would crack and ulcerate, hidden beneath the jeweled buckles and gold embroidery that signaled the woman's divine right to rule. Because the great trains of the gowns acted as massive, unwashed sponges for the filth of the court, the lower petticoats were perpetually damp with a mixture of spilled wine, fireplace, soot, and the palace sludge of mud and animal waste. This moisture would wick upward into the silk stockings, creating a permanent poultice of bacteria that pressed against the cracked skin of the heels. In the absence of podiatry, royal gout was often misdiagnosed, masking what was actually localized sepsis or gangrene caused by the toxic dyes of the hosiery leaching into open wounds. The stench of rotting feet was so prevalent among the high-born that petal perfumes, heavy oils of cloves, and sandalwood were applied directly to the inside of the shoes to mask the scent of decaying tissue. To make matters worse, the fashionable white lead used to powder the legs for portraits would flake off and mix with the sweat, creating a caustic paste that further eroded the skin, leaving the most powerful women in the world with legs that were a map of chemical burns and parasitic bites. By the end of a long gala, a queen might be standing on feet that were bleeding into her silk slippers, her toes numbed by the cold and the constriction, while she maintained a serene smile for the ambassadors. This basal filth was the final layer of the aristocratic lie, a foundation of rotting silk and poisoned skin that supported the towering lard of the hair and the leaden mask of the face. The very ground they walked on was a source of infection, as the heavy fabrics dragged through the detritus of centuries, bringing the pathogens of the street directly into the royal bedchamber, where they would settle into the heavy velvet curtains and wait for the next day's ritual of dressing to begin the cycle of filth all over again. The final frontier of the royal nightmare resided in the bedchamber, a space that modern imagination often paints as a sanctuary of silk and down, but which in reality functioned as a stagnant reservoir for the cumulative filth of the day's display. When the grueling ritual of la couture or the formal undressing finally began, the removal of the gown was not a relief, but a violent liberation of odors and trapped toxins that had been compressed against the body for up to 18 hours. As the ladies-in-waiting unlaced the stays, the sudden expansion of the ribcage and the rush of blood back into the crushed internal organs often caused the royal woman to experience agonizing perfusion cramps or even a secondary fainting spell as her blood pressure fluctuated wildly. The chemise, now a stiffened, yellowed parchment of dried sweat and skin oils, was peeled away from the torso like a bandage from a wound, often taking with it layers of skin that had adhered to the fabric through the garment fermentation process. Because the heavy velvet bed curtains were rarely laundered and were designed to keep out the deadly night air, the royal bed became a velvet-lined coffin of carbon dioxide and recycled dander, where the queen would lay her damaged face upon pillows that were frequently infested with the same bedbugs and lice that inhabited her gowns. The night shroud, or sleeping shift, was often made of the same heavy linen as the day smock, and, because the room was kept sealed to prevent miasmas, the moisture from the woman's breath and skin would saturate the heavy tapestries, creating a permanent dampness that smelled of mildew and stale musk. In this suffocating environment, the parasitic cycle continued unabated. The fleas that had spent the day in the hem of the gown would migrate into the seams of the mattress, while the lard rot from the woman's unwashed hair would transfer to the silk pillowcases, attracting the same rodents that scurried across the palace floors. The great bed was not a place of recovery but a place of secondary infection, where the open sores from the corset and the chemical burns from the lead-based makeup were exposed to the bacteria of the unwashed linens for hours on end. Royal Women often woke with the palsy, a chronic conjunctivitis caused by the dust and hair powder particles that settled into their eyelids during the night, and their first act of the morning was not to wash, but to have their servants apply a fresh layer of white lead over the previous night's decay. This horizontal filth ensured that the body never had a moment of true cleanliness or healing, as the royal woman was merely transitioned from one structural cage to another, her life a continuous loop of toxic adornment and organic decomposition. The very air she breathed was a cocktail of lead dust, rancid animal fat, and the evaporating waste of a court that considered water to be an enemy of health, creating a cycle of boring horror that defined the lives of the most envied women in history, a reality of secret rot hidden beneath the surface of eternal, shimmering gold. Since we have fully unraveled the anatomy of the gown and the bedchamber, we must now descend into the gilded gut and the toxic apothecary, exploring the internal filth that resulted from the royal diet and the terrifying medical cures that royal women ingested to combat the very symptoms their clothing was causing. The royal digestive tract was a battleground of excess and stagnation, as the elite diet of the 17th and 18th centuries almost entirely excluded fiber, fresh vegetables, or plain water, which were seen as peasant foods that lacked the humoral heat required for a noble constitution. Instead, a princess would consume a relentless parade of heavy meats, like venison, swan, and boar, all preserved with massive quantities of salt and sugar, which, when combined with the extreme physical compression of the corset, turned the stomach into a slow boiling cauldron of acid and undigested proteins. Because the bowels were physically displaced and crushed by the whalebone stays, the royal blockage became a chronic condition, leading to the regular use of heroic medicine, which consisted of violent purgatives like mercuric chloride or calomel. These substances were intended to flush the system, but instead caused the gums to recede, the jawbone to soften, and a constant, metallic-smelling drool to leak from the corners of the mouth, which the woman would have to discreetly dab away with a lace handkerchief already stiff with lead-based starch. To settle the vapors, or the constant nausea caused by liver failure and toxic makeup, royal physicians would prescribe the king's drops, a tincture made of crushed human skull, spirit of wine, and opium, which left the royal woman in a state of permanent, glassy-eyed sedation while her internal organs slowly shut down from heavy metal poisoning. This internal filth manifested as the black tongue, or the great putrefaction, where the breath became so foul from decaying teeth and stomach bile that even the strongest ambergris perfumes could not fully mask the scent of a woman's words. When a queen suffered from the hysterical fit, which we now know was likely a combination of oxygen deprivation from her corset and lead-induced brain swelling, the cure was often blistering, where a caustic paste of crushed Spanish fly cantharides was applied to the back of the neck or the inner thighs to raise massive, weeping blisters. These wounds were never cleaned, only covered by the same unwashed silk stockings and shift sleeves we discussed earlier, leading to secondary staph infections that the royal woman was expected to ignore while she sat through a 5-hour state banquet. The very water they did use for medicine was often stored in lead-lined cisterns or copper vats, ensuring that every healing draft was merely adding another layer of poison to their already failing systems. This internal decay was the ultimate secret concealed by the gown. While the silk moved with grace and the diamonds caught the light, the woman inside was a walking chemical experiment, her blood a slurry of mercury and opium, and her digestive system a stagnant wasteland of salted meats and heavy metals. This was the boring history of the royal interior, a slow, agonizing transformation of a living human being into a preserved, yet rotting, statue of statehood, where the cure was almost always more lethal than the filth it sought to remedy. The transition from the royal mother's toxic womb to the suffocating environment of the imperial nursery represented the next generation's induction into a life of gilded filth and structural deformity, where the infant's body was treated not as a growing organism, but as a piece of soft clay to be molded by the same dangerous materials that were killing the adults. From the very moment of birth, A royal child was denied the basic human right of clean air and unrestricted movement, as the prevailing medical belief of the time dictated that a baby's limbs would grow crooked unless they were tightly bound in swaddling bands, long, unwashed strips of linen that were wrapped so tightly around the infant's torso and legs that the child was rendered a rigid, immobile mummy for the first 6 to 9 months of its life. Because the royal nursery was often located in the dampest, most drafty corner of the palace to keep the noise away from the court, these swaddlings were rarely changed more than once a day to avoid exposing the infant to the deadly chill of the room, meaning the child lay in its own acidic waste for hours, leading to nursery rot or severe ammoniacal dermatitis that would cause the skin to peel away in weeping sheets. These raw sores were then treated with the same toxic powders used by the mother, finely ground lead and starch, which were absorbed directly into the infant's bloodstream, causing developmental delays, the royal tremor, and a chronic irritability that was often misdiagnosed as teething convulsions. To suit the crying child, the wet nurse, who was often a commoner with her own set of unwashed garments and parasitic infestations, would rub the infant's gums with Godfrey's cordial, a lethal concoction of opium, treacle, and sassafras that left the royal nurseries in a state of eerie, drugged silence, while the infant's pupils remained perpetually constricted and their breathing shallow and labored. As the child grew, the soft bone stage began, where the lack of sunlight in the shadowed palace corridors led to a near-universal prevalence of rickets, a vitamin D deficiency that softened the leg bones until they bowed under the weight of the child's first tiny, lead-weighted gowns. To correct this, the royal physicians would bypass the obvious need for sunlight and instead strap the toddlers into walking cages or heavy iron leg braces hidden beneath layers of stiff brocade, which only served to further atrophy the muscles and grind the soft joints into permanent misalignment. The feeding of the royal child was another source of internal filth. They were often fed pap, a mixture of flour, water, and stale bread from silver pap boats that were polished with toxic mercuric compounds and rarely scrubbed of the fermented residue from the previous meal, leading to chronic gastroenteric fevers that claimed the lives of nearly half of all royal offspring before the age of 5. The survivors were those whose constitutions were strong enough to endure a daily intake of lead-tainted milk and opium-laced tonics, all while being encased in miniature versions of the adult stays by age 4, beginning the lifelong process of crushing the internal organs before they had even finished developing. This generational filth meant that the royal line was physically degrading with every successor, as the toxic environment of the nursery ensured that the future kings and queens reached adulthood with weakened hearts, brittle bones, and brains, already clouded by heavy metal accumulation and chronic hypoxia. Even the toys of the royal children were death traps, often painted with bright emerald green arsenic or cinnabar red mercury, which the infants would naturally suck on, introducing the poisons directly into their mucosal membranes. The nursery was not a place of growth, but a place of slow, ornamental poisoning, where the divine right of the child was manifested as a life of silent suffering, wrapped in the same fermented linens and leaden finery that would eventually define their adult existence in the filth of the court. The subterranean cauldron of the gilded gut. The journey of every morsel of food destined for a royal mouth began in a subterranean hellscape that functioned as the palace's metabolic center, a place where the concepts of sanitation and cross-contamination were entirely absent, replaced by a desperate struggle to produce magnificent dishes in an environment of total biological chaos. Because the kitchens were often located directly beneath the staterooms to ensure the food arrived warm, the heat from the massive hearths which burned around the clock turned the basement into a humid incubator for every pathogen known to the medieval and early modern world. The walls of these kitchens were perpetually slick with a mixture of soot and vaporized animal fat, creating a kitchen sludge that would occasionally drip back into the open vats of pottage and roasting pans, adding a layer of industrial grime to the noble diet. The cooking vessels themselves were the primary source of the slow, systemic poisoning that defined the royal life. The most prized kettles and pans were made of unlined copper, which, when exposed to acidic ingredients like vinegar, wine, or citrus, would undergo a chemical reaction that produced verdigris, a toxic copper acetate that leached directly into the sauces. The result was a chronic, low-level copper poisoning that caused the royal family to suffer from constant nausea, metallic tastes, and green bile syndrome, all of which were further complicated by the use of lead-glazed ceramics for storage. As the wine and vinegar sat in these lead-lined jugs, the lead would dissolve into the liquid, creating a sweet poison that the royals drank in massive quantities, leading to the lead palsy and cognitive decline that plagued so many dynasties. Within the kitchen itself, the scullery filth was a permanent fixture. The floors were covered in a layer of old rushes and sawdust meant to soak up the blood of slaughtered livestock, but this layer was rarely replaced, becoming a fermenting carpet of biological waste that harbored colonies of black rats and kitchen adders. The cooks, working in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit, would perspire heavily into the food, and because their own hygiene was non-existent, the royal flavor was often a literal infusion of human salt and skin flora. The preparation of the great roasts was a particular sight of hidden filth. A whole ox or stag would be turned on a spit for 12 hours, during which time the exterior would become charred and coated in soot while the interior remained a lukewarm breeding ground for salmonella and E. coli, to hide the taste of meat that had begun to turn. In the lack of refrigeration, the royal chefs utilized a spicing strategy, drenching the flesh in massive amounts of pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, which acted as a sensory mask for the underlying putrefaction. This was further complicated by the gilded presentation, where the skin of a peacock or swan would be preserved with mercury-based drying agents and then stretched back over the cooked meat to make the bird look alive on the table. As the hot meat set beneath the toxic skin, the mercury vapors would penetrate the roast, ensuring that the king and queen were ingesting neurotoxins with every bite. The silver service was no safer, as the silver platters were polished with rouge, a compound that often contained high levels of iron oxide and lead, which would transfer to the food as it was sliced. Even the royal water was a carrier of death. Because the palace plumbing where it existed utilized lead pipes and open-air cisterns where pigeons would drown and rot, the water was so contaminated with tombstone bacteria that no royal would touch it, choosing instead to drink fermented ales and wines that were themselves laced with lead to clarify the vintage. The result of this culinary alchemy was a royal body that was internally pickled in a cocktail of copper, lead, and rotting protein, a biological reality that perfectly mirrored the fermented filth trapped beneath their silk gowns. The divine right to eat the finest foods in the world was, in reality, a death sentence delivered on a silver platter, as the very fuel that sustained the royal line was the same substance that ensured their teeth would rot, their bones would soften, and their minds would slip into the gilded madness of the mercury-tainted court. This was the boring history of the kitchen, a relentless cycle of heat, heavy metals, and hidden decay that ensured the royal stomach was just as contaminated as the royal wardrobe. The grave-robbing beauty and the corpse medicinato treat the fainting fits and the chronic green sickness, anemia caused by lead poisoning and oxygen deprivation. Royal physicians turned to mumia, a substance created by grinding up Egyptian mummies, or more commonly, the fresh remains of executed criminals. The belief was that the vital spark of a deceased person could be transferred to the living royal through ingestion. A queen might start her morning by drinking a spirit of human skull, where the bone was distilled into a pungent tincture and mixed with chocolate to mask the taste of calcified death. This was not a rare occurrence. King Charles II of England famously spent hours in his laboratory distilling the king's drops, which contained the essence of human brains, and he shared these rejuvenating drafts with the women of his court. This meant that while a royal woman stood in her shimmering, unwashed silk, her stomach was literally digesting the powdered remains of the lower classes, creating a hidden internal filth that was both moral and physical. The filth extended to the application of human fat salves collected from the gallows which were rubbed into the sores caused by the corset's whalebone stays. These fats, often rancid and teeming with post-mortem bacteria, were thought to have miraculous healing powers, but in reality, they introduced cadaverous pathogens directly into the bloodstream of the royal patient, leading to localized gallows gangrene that smelled worse than the palace sewers. The boring history of this period reveals that the more civilized the court appeared, the more savage its medical practices became. To combat the hair loss caused by Venetian ceruse, the white lead makeup, ladies-in-waiting would prepare a scalp tonic made of honey, bear grease, and burnt human hair, which was plastered onto the queen's head and left to sit for days. This sticky, organic sludge would harden under her wig, attracting more vermin and creating a secondary layer of crust that could only be removed by scraping the scalp with silver knives. Furthermore, the use of the moss of the skull, usnea, a lichen that grew on the skulls of men who died violent deaths, was considered a sovereign remedy for nosebleeds and headaches. It was snorted as a powder or applied as a poultice, meaning the royal woman was constantly inhaling the fungal growth of the dead. This cycle of ingestion and application meant that the hidden filth was no longer just sweat, lead, and urine. It was a literal integration of the dead into the living. The royal glow seen in portraits was often the result of arsenic eaters, women who took small doses of arsenic to achieve a translucent, pale look, combined with the feverish flush of a body struggling to process the decayed human proteins and heavy metals. By the time a woman reached her 30s, her internal chemistry was a toxic soup of opium, mercury, human bone, and lead, all held together by a ribcage that had been permanently deformed into a funnel shape. This was the ultimate secret of the royal gown. It wasn't just concealing an unwashed body. It was a decorative shroud for a living corpse that was being preserved by the very poisons and morbid treatments meant to save it. The architectural grandeur of the great palaces Versailles, the Louvre, and Whitehall served as the final, massive outer garment that encased the royal woman, acting not as a ventilated sanctuary but as a sprawling, gilded trap for the miasmas and biological waste we have discussed. To understand the architecture of Rot, one must realize that these structures were never designed for the habitation of thousands of people in an era without centralized plumbing. Instead, they were massive stage sets where the divine rite was performed amidst a rising tide of human excrement and stagnant air. The Hall of Mirrors, for all its crystalline beauty, was a corridor of concentrated stench. Because the windows were rarely opened to avoid the deadly drafts that were thought to cause pneumonia, the air became a thick, humid slurry of unwashed bodies, melting candle wax, and the palace sludge being dragged in on the hems of 5-pound silk gowns. In palaces like Versailles, the lack of designated bathrooms meant that the courtiers and even the royals themselves often utilized the staircase method or the curtain corner, where the deep alcoves and heavy tapestries served as unofficial latrines. The velvet hangings, which were almost never cleaned because of their intricate gold embroidery, absorbed these waste vapors over decades, becoming biological sponges that released a pungent, ammonia-rich odor whenever a breeze moved through the room. This environment was further poisoned by the heating paradox. Because the massive fireplaces could only warm the air within a few feet of the hearth, the rest of the room remained a freezing, damp cave where moisture condensed on the silk-covered walls, leading to the growth of imperial mold behind the portraits of kings. This dampness was the perfect conductor for the pathogens dwelling in the royal gowns. As a woman moved through the palace, the friction of her petticoats released a fine dust of dried sweat, lead makeup, and skin cells into the air, which then settled onto the rush mats or the elaborate parquet floors. These floors were rarely scrubbed. Instead, they were polished with wax and bone black, creating a slick, dark surface that concealed layers of compacted filth. The great galleries functioned as wind tunnels for infection, moving the miasmic air from the crowded kitchens and the open pit latrines in the courtyards directly into the queen's private apartments. The ceiling paintings, depicting gods and goddesses in clear blue skies, looked down upon a reality where the floor was often stained with the leakage of birdalows and the vomit of courtiers suffering from gilded gut poisoning. Even the royal gardens, designed with geometric perfection, were often irrigated with water that had bypassed the palace's primitive sewer trenches, meaning the scent of orange blossoms was frequently overpowered by the smell of night soil being spread on the parterres. The architectural design of enfilades, where rooms were connected in a straight line with no hallways, meant that there was no privacy and no escape from the collective aroma of the court. To get from one end of the palace to the other, one had to walk through a succession of aroma chambers, each hosting a different stage of organic decay. This was the boring history of the palace, a world where the most sophisticated architecture on Earth was essentially a decorative lid on a massive and ventilated cesspool, ensuring that the royal woman was never not for a single second of her life breathing air that was free from the particles of her own and her court's slow decomposition. The palace was the gown made of stone, and like the silk dress, it was beautiful on the outside, but its seams were packed with the hidden filth of 1,000 lives lived in a state of magnificent, toxic squalor. The transition from the architectural stench of the palace to the final, silent entombment of the royal body represents the ultimate culmination of a life lived in gilded filth, where the process of royal embalming and the lead-lined afterlife ensured that the toxins accumulated during life were sealed into the flesh for eternity. To satisfy your request for an even more expansive and boring immersion into this morbid history, we must look at the final hours of the royal woman, where the physicians, realizing the gown-induced toxins were finally winning, attempted one last, violent internal purge to save her soul, if not her body. As the queen lay dying in a bed saturated with the sweat of her final fever, the room was crowded with courtiers whose own unwashed presence added a final, suffocating layer of miasma to her last breaths. Upon her passing, the ritual of the opening began, a gruesome anatomical performance where the internal organs, which had been crushed and displaced by decades of tight lacing, were removed to prevent the body from exploding due to post-mortem fermentation. These organs, often found to be blackened by mercury or shriveled by chronic lead poisoning, were placed into separate leaden urns, the canopic jars of the West, while the hollowed cavity of the torso was stuffed with the dry filth, composed of aromatic herbs, salt, and sawdust to soak up the remaining fluids. The body was then subjected to the final adornment, where the skin, already scarred by chemical burns and parasitic bites, was scrubbed one last time with a mixture of spirits of wine and turpentine, effectively stripping the remaining epidermis. The embalmers would then pump the veins full of spirit of vinegar and wax, a primitive preservation technique that often caused the face to bloat into a grotesque, waxen mask of its former self. Because the royal dignity had to be maintained, even in death, the corpse was then dressed in its most magnificent and most toxic gown, a garment stiff with gold thread and lead-pigmented dyes that would never be seen by the public, as it was immediately encased in a triple-layered coffin. The innermost layer was made of lead, soldered shut to trap the gases of decomposition, creating a chemical pressure cooker where the remains would slowly liquefy over the centuries. This leaden seal was crucial because the palaces and cathedrals where these women were buried were often built over damp, shifting ground. Without the lead, the stench of the ancients would seep through the stone floors of the royal chapels, sickening the living. The boring history of these tombs reveals a terrifying chemical reality. When modern archaeologists have opened these lead-lined coffins, they have often found the bodies preserved in a toxic soup of their own melted fats and the mercury used in the embalming process. The hair, still caked in the lard and powder of the final hairstyle, often remains perfectly intact, while the silk of the gown has been reduced to a dark, acidic sludge. This is the final secret of the royal woman. Her gown was not just a symbol of status, but the first layer of her coffin, a wearable monument to the filth that defined her existence. Even in the silence of the crypt, the lead from her makeup, the mercury from her medicine, and the arsenic from her dress remained with her, ensuring that her divine body was a permanent vessel for the very poisons that had made her life a Misery. The funeral processions, which could last for days, moved through the streets of the capital, the heavy scent of incense struggling to mask the metallic odor of the lead-lined box, a final hall of miasma that followed the queen to her rest. This concludes the journey of the Hidden Filth, a cycle that began with the single lead-based cosmetic and ended in a leaden box, proving that for the royal women of history, beauty was a terminal condition, and the boring details of their daily hygiene were the true architects of their tragic, gilded ends. The Emerald Death and the Cage of Fire. The Victorian era introduced a new, invisible layer of filth to the royal woman's wardrobe: systemic arsenic poisoning. In the mid-19th century, the most fashionable color for royal gala gowns was Shields green, a vibrant, luminous emerald hue achieved by saturating silk with copper arsenite. A single ball gown could contain as much as 900 grains of arsenic, enough to kill dozens of people. As the royal woman moved or danced, the friction of her heavy skirts would release a fine, odorless green dust that settled into her pores and was inhaled into her lungs, causing her to suffer from chronic internal ulcerations and a slow, agonizing failure of the liver and kidneys. This wasn't just dirt, it was a microscopic layer of death that coated the skin, turning the hidden filth into a lethal weapon. Beneath these poisonous green layers, the physical structure of the gown reached its most extreme form with the crinolet and the cage crinoline, a massive apparatus of steel hoops and horsehair that could span up to 6 feet in diameter. While these cages provided a temporary relief from the weight of 30 layers of petticoats, they created a vortex of filth within the skirt's cavernous interior. Because the skirts were so wide, royal women were physically distanced from everything, including their own bodies. They could not see where they were stepping, leading to the hemsuck effect, where the bottom of the gown would drag through the soot, horse manure, and street sludge of London, pulling those contaminants deep into the internal structure of the dress. The hygiene of the Victorian royal was a paradox of surface purity and secret putrefaction. While the upper layers of the gown were meticulously brushed and scented with violet water, the undercage remained a dark, airless environment, where the warmth of the legs and the moisture of the body created a tropical climate for bacteria. The introduction of aniline dyes added a new horror. These synthetic pigments, used for stockings and under ruffles, were often made with nitrobenzene, which would leach into the skin and cause cyanosis, a condition where the royal woman's blood could no longer carry oxygen, turning her lips and fingernails a haunting, sickly blue look that was tragically fashionable as the consumptive chic. Furthermore, the sheer volume of the crinoline made the bowel logistics we discussed earlier even more impossible. Women would often wear split crotch drawers, but the risk of catching the steel hoops on a piece of furniture or a carriage door meant that many royals lived in a state of constant physical anxiety, their bladders permanently distended and their kidneys under a state of chronic compression stress. The most terrifying element of this era, however, was the inflammable filth. The combination of dry silk, arsenic dust, and the oxygen-rich chimney effect created by the hollow cage of the skirt turned the royal woman into a human torch. If a stray spark from a fireplace or a fallen candle touched the hem, the entire gown would erupt in a flash of green flame, incinerating the wearer in seconds because she was physically bolted into the steel cage and could not escape. Thousands of women died this way, their magnificent gowns becoming their pyres. This was the boring history of the Victorian elite, a life lived in a cage of poisoned steel, breathing in arsenic dust and waiting for the moment their own finery would ignite, all while maintaining the stiff, upright posture of a moral and social icon. The filth was no longer just organic, it was industrial, chemical, and explosive, a final evolution of the hidden filth that proved the more modern the gown became, the more efficient it was at killing the woman inside it. The transition from the Victorian cage of fire to the medieval miasma of the Black Death and the 14th century gown takes us into the deepest, most ancient layers of the hidden filth, where the concept of hygiene was not just neglected, but was feared as a spiritual transgression. To provide the massive, 10 word level immersion you're looking for, we must look at the 14th century royal woman as a walking reliquary of biological terror, her gowns constructed during an era when the humors of the body were believed to be governed by the stars, and the air itself was considered a carrier of the demonic plague. During this period, the cot or kirtle, the tight-fitting undergown, was worn for months on end without removal, as the laces were often sewn shut by hand to ensure a perfect, skin-tight fit that emphasized the woman's silhouette. This meant that the royal skin was never washed, only dry scraped with a linen cloth if a layer of grime became too thick to ignore. As the Black Death swept through Europe, royal women fled to isolated castles, piling on layers of heavy wool and fur-lined surcoats that acted as massive filters for the plague-carrying fleas. These fleas, Xenopsilochiopus, did not live on the skin but in the seams of the wool and the deep, matted fibers of the ermine trim. A queen might be wearing a gown worth a kingdom's ransom, but within the armpits and the groin seams of that gown, thousands of flea eggs were incubating in the warmth of her unwashed body, waiting to hatch and feast on her noble blood. The internal filth of this era was defined by the humoral fermentation. Because medical theory suggested that bathing opened the body to evil vapors, royal women developed a thick, protective crust of dead skin and old sweat that they believed kept them safe from the plague. This crust, however, became the perfect substrate for the Great Itch, a combination of scabies and body lice that caused the woman to frantically scratch her skin raw beneath her heavy silks. These open wounds were then exposed to the dye rot of the time. Medieval dyes were often stabilized with stale human urine and fermented vegetable matter, creating a caustic chemical environment that led to curdle ulcers, deep, weeping sores that would never heal because the gown was never removed. To mask the scent of these rotting sores and the general odor of sanctity, the stench of unwashed holiness, the royal woman would carry a nosegay or a sachet of dried wormwood and rue, but these herbs only added a bitter, medicinal top note to the overwhelming smell of ammonia and decaying flesh. The boring history of the medieval royal toilet was equally grim. The garderobe, or palace latrine, was essentially a hole in the stone wall that dropped waste directly into the castle moat. Because the wind would often blow up through these holes, the royal woman's heavy skirts would act as a sail, catching the rising fumes of the moat sewage and trapping them within the layers of her petticoats. This meant that a princess, walking through the great hall, was carrying the concentrated essence of the castle's waste within the folds of her velvet, a secret filth that she would bring back to her bedchamber every night. The weight of the medieval houppelande, a gown with massive, floor-sweeping sleeves, further exacerbated the filth, as the sleeves acted as brooms that gathered the rush sludge of the floor. In the 1300s, palace floors were covered in a layer of dried rushes that were replaced only once a year. Underneath the top layer lay a putrid mixture of spilled ale, grease, dog droppings, and the bones of past meals. As the royal woman moved, her sleeves would dip into this fermenting mess, absorbing the liquids and dragging the pathogens upward toward her face. This was the true hidden filth of the Middle Ages, a world where the most beautiful women were essentially walking biohazards, their bodies encased in layers of wool and fur that served as a mobile habitat for the very plague that was destroying their civilizations. They lived in a state of permanent, dermal stagnation, where the air they breathed and the clothes they wore were all part of a single, continuous ecosystem of rot, held together by the belief that cleanliness was a danger, and that the stench of the body was merely a sign of its earthly burden. The Tudor tooth rot and the Venetian Saracen, the 16th century, the hidden filth of the royal woman, underwent a chemical evolution that focused on the face as much as the body. The Elizabethan ideal was a mask of virginity, complexion as white as marble and as smooth as glass, but the reality was a landscape of lead-induced decay. To achieve this look, the royal woman applied Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white, lead, and vinegar. This substance was not merely a cosmetic, it was a corrosive agent. Over months of use, the lead would be absorbed through the pores, entering the bloodstream and causing plumbism, which resulted in the graying of the skin, the loss of hair leading to the necessity of heavy, lard-filled wigs, and the loosening of the teeth. To combat the graying skin, the woman would apply even thicker layers of the white paste, sometimes up to a quarter-inch thick, which would crack like dry mud when she smiled. Because the lead was eating away at her natural flesh, the royal woman's face beneath the makeup was often a map of lead craters and open sores, which were never cleaned, only filled with more toxic paste. The internal filth was further compounded by the sugar craze of the Tudor court. With the arrival of massive quantities of sugar from the New World, it became a status symbol to consume subtleties, elaborate sculptures made of pure sugar. Royal women would eat these treats all day. But since the concept of the toothbrush did not exist, their mouths became breeding grounds for the Black Decay. By the time Queen Elizabeth reached her 60s, her teeth were described by foreign ambassadors as very black and uneven, a condition caused by a combination of rampant cavities and the lead in her makeup. To hide the stench of rotting teeth and the ammonia breath caused by failing kidneys, royal women would chew on breath pellets made of musk and ambergris, which merely added a cloying, sweet scent to the odor of putrefaction. The filth was so pervasive that even the royal tongue was often coated in a thick, white fungal growth called thrush, caused by the constant intake of sugar and the lack of oral hygiene. Beneath the chin, the great ruffs of the Tudor era added a mechanical layer of torture. These massive, circular collars were stiffened with starch, which in the 1500s was often made from wheat or corn. However, in humid weather, the starch would soften and begin to ferment, smelling like sour bread. To keep the ruffs upright, supportuses or wire frames were used, which would chafe against the lead-powdered neck, creating starch sores that would weep into the lace. Because the ruffs were so large, the woman could not see her own feet or even her own lap, making the bowel logistics of the Tudor era involving heavy, unwashed velvet petticoats and a total lack of undergarments a nightmare of blind maneuvering. The weight of the Spanish farthingale, cone-shaped hoop skirt made of bent cane or whalebone created a dark, bell-shaped chamber where the heat of the body was trapped. In this airless void, the menstrual rags of the royal woman, often made of unwashed linen, would sit for days during her cycle, contributing to a metallic, sour aroma that mingled with the heavy scents of the court. This was the boring history of the Tudor elite, a life lived behind a cracking mask of lead, with a mouth full of blackening teeth and a body encased in fermenting starch and heavy velvet, proving that the more regal woman appeared, the more she was actually a prisoner of her own chemical and biological decay. The sewer les Versailles and the perfumed miasmathy fundamental horror of Versailles lay in its design. It was a palace built for spectacle, not for sanitation. Despite its hundreds of rooms and thousands of courtiers, there were almost no permanent latrines. The hidden filth of the royal woman at Versailles began with the fact that she was living in a building where the corridors, staircases, and even the spaces behind the heavy velvet tapestries were used as public toilets. Because the walk to a commode was often too long through the endless enfilades, noblemen and women alike would simply relieve themselves in the corners of the galleries. This meant that the palace sludge we discussed earlier was not just mud. It was a concentrated slurry of human excrement that coated the parquet floors. As a royal woman walked to a state dinner, the 6-foot train of her silk gown, costing the equivalent of a modern luxury car, would act as a massive mop, dragging through this waste and absorbing it into the fibers of the fabric. Because these gowns were made of heavy brocade and metallic threads, they could never be washed. Instead, the servants would wait for the waste to dry and then attempt to brush it off with stiff bristles, a process that merely pushed the microscopic particles deeper into the weave. To combat this overwhelming atmospheric stench, Louis Sivhu himself was said to smell like a wild animal due to his own lack of bathing, ordered that the fountains be heavily perfumed and that bowls of potpourri be placed in every room. For the royal woman, the solution was the scented armor. Her gown was not just a dress, it was a chemical shield. She would wear perfumed gloves made of leather that had been soaked in ambergris and civet for weeks to hide the smell of her unwashed hands. Her fans were saturated with oils of tuberose and jasmine, which she would frantically wave in front of her face to create a scented bubble that protected her from the ammonia rising from the floors. However, this created a toxic cocktail of odors. The cloying sweetness of the perfume mixed with the sour smell of unwashed bodies and the rot of the palace, leading to chronic vapor headaches and fainting spells that were often mistaken for delicate femininity. Beneath the gown, the stays, the 17th century corset, were made of stiffened buckram and whalebone that had never seen water. These stays absorbed the sweat of the wearer during the long, hot ceremonies in the unventilated galleries, turning the garment into a stiff, salt-encrusted cage that rubbed the skin of the torso raw. The hygiene of the Sun Queen was further compromised by the powder epidemic. Because bathing was still feared as a source of illness, the hair and body were cleaned using dry powders made of starch and crushed bones. These powders would mix with the body's natural oils to form a thick, gray paste that settled into the folds of the skin and the creases of the gown. Within this paste, the Versailles louse thrived. These lice were so prevalent that louse traps, small, decorative gold tubes containing a piece of blood-soaked cloth, were worn as jewelry, hanging from the bodice to lure the insects away from the woman's breasts. The boring history of this era reveals that the most powerful women in Europe were essentially living in a state of gilded squatting, where the beauty of their diamonds and the sparkle of the fountains were merely a distraction from the fact that they were breathing in the powdered waste of their own court. The Hidden Filth was an all-encompassing environment, a world where the line between the royal body and the palace waste was permanently blurred, and where the divine right was lived in a cloud of perfume, lead, and human decay. The Black Widow's shroud and the soot-stained skin. In the late 1800s, following the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria plunged the royal court into a state of permanent mourning that lasted for 40 years. This era turned the Hidden Filth into a dark, monochromatic nightmare. The royal mourning gown was constructed from crepe, a hard, scratchy silk that was treated with a combination of shellac and toxic black dyes derived from logwood and iron liquor. Because crepe was intended to be matte and light-absorbing, was highly porous, acting as a massive vacuum for the coal soot and London peasouper fog that permeated the palace. A royal woman in mourning was essentially wearing a garment made of industrial carbon. As she moved, the black dye would crock rubbing off onto her skin and turning her hands, neck, and torso a permanent, ghostly gray. This was not just a stain. The chemicals in the dye, which included heavy metals used as mordants, would enter the bloodstream through the skin, causing mourning malaise, a chronic state of lethargy, headaches, and skin inflammation that was often mistaken for the natural grief of a widow. The hygiene of the Black Widow was further compromised by the jet and bog oak jewelry. To match their black gowns, royal women wore heavy necklaces and bracelets made of fossilized coal or jet. These pieces, resting directly against the lead-powdered skin, would trap sweat and skin oils in their intricate carvings, creating a biological sludge that was never clean. Beneath the black crepe, the mourning chemise was also dyed dark or remained unwashed for weeks to maintain the solemnity of the ritual. This meant that the royal woman was encased in a carbon cocoon, where the moisture of her body turned the black dye into a caustic liquid that irritated the skin until it wept. Because the color black hid the visible filth so effectively, these gowns were worn far longer than the brightly colored silks of the previous eras, leading to a buildup of stale grief, a mixture of dried tears, perspiration, and the odors of a body that was essentially pickling in its own dark pigments. The internal filth of the Victorian mourning period was dominated by nervous tonics. To handle the social pressure of constant grief, royal women were prescribed laudanum, opium and alcohol, and vin mariani, wine infused with cocaine. These substances, taken to settle the nerves, slowed the digestive system to a near halt, exacerbating the bowel blockage caused by the tight-laced mourning corsets. The result was a royal woman who was internally stagnant and externally coated in soot and heavy metals. Her breath, often smelling of the bitter almonds associated with the chemicals in her veil, was a sign of the toxic environment she inhabited. This was the boring history of the Victorian morning ritual, a life lived in a pitch-black cage of scratchy, poisonous silk, where the filth was hidden by the darkness of the dye, and where the divine right was to suffer in a state of chemically induced, carbon-stained sorrow. The royal gown was no longer a celebration of life. It was a mobile monument to the grave, concealing a body that was slowly being absorbed by the very blackness it wore as a badge of honor. The radioactive wardrobe and the museum Hazmat secret final evolution of the royal gown's filth is its transformation into toxic heritage. When a 19th century royal gown or a Tudor fragment enters a modern museum collection, it is not treated as a piece of art, but as a hazardous waste site. Because of the systemic poisoning, we have detailed the arsenic greens, the lead whites, the mercury blushes, and the nitrobenzene blacks. These garments are technically hot. In the 1890s, the introduction of radium for glow-in-the-dark embroidery and watch faces meant that some royal accessories are literally radioactive. When a curator opens a storage box containing a Victorian gala dress, they are met with a chemical cloud of off-gassing arsenic dust and volatile organic compounds that have been marinating in a sealed environment for over a century. This dust is so fine that it can penetrate standard surgical masks, leading modern conservators to wear full-body Tyvek suits, double nitrile gloves, and P100 respirators just to move a skirt from one shelf to another. The hidden filth of the past has now become the invisible threat of the present. The perspiration and skin cells we discussed, the garment fermentation, have, over 150 years, broken down into acidic salts that eat away at the very silk they once inhabited. This process, known as shattered silk, occurs because the metallic salts used to weigh down the fabric to give the royal woman that expensive rustle have oxidized. This oxidation releases a microscopic, glass-like dust that can lacerate the lungs of anyone breathing it in. When you see a royal gown behind glass in a museum, you are looking at a biochemical bomb. The glass is not there to protect the dress from you. It is there to protect you from the dress. The palace sludge trapped in the hems has dried into a concentrated powder of ancient pathogens and heavy metals. Curators often find that the boxes containing these gowns are heavy with lead dust that has flacked off the bodices, creating a layer of toxic silt at the bottom of the archival tissue paper. The hygiene of the museum is a reversal of the palace. Instead of perfume masking the rot, we have high-efficiency particulate air HEPA filtration systems stripping the air of the royal aroma. The boring history of conservation reveals that many early museum workers suffered from curator's palsy, form of chronic lead and arsenic poisoning before the true toxicity of these gowns was understood. Even the mourning crepe of the Black Widow era is dangerous. The iron-based dyes have turned the fabric so acidic that it can char the paper it touches, a phenomenon called acid migration. The royal woman's filth has outlived her, preserved in the very fibers that once tortured her. These gowns are no longer clothing. They are anthropological residue, a physical record of a time when the human body was a vessel for industrial poisons. To study them is to engage with a gilded grave, where the shimmer of the gold thread is often the only thing keeping the disintegrating, toxic silk from collapsing into a pile of hazardous dust. This is the ultimate conclusion of the boring history of sleep, a world where the beauty of the past is so filthy, so contaminated, and so chemically unstable that it can only be viewed through layers of glass and handled by people dressed like astronauts. The lead-soaked splendor and the Roman imperial bath, hidden filth, of the Roman royal woman was not caused by a lack of water, but by the toxicity of the infrastructure. The Roman Empire was built on lead. It lined the massive aqueducts, the pipes fistula that brought water into the private villas, and the very bathtubs where the empress would soak for hours. This meant that the purifying water was actually a concentrated solution of lead acetate, which was absorbed through the skin in a process of dermal seeding. As the royal woman sat in her marble tub, her pores would open in the heat of the calidarium, allowing the lead to enter her bloodstream and begin the imperial decay. This was further exacerbated by the use of sapa, a sweetener made by boiling grape juice in lead pots. The empress would consume this sugar of lead in her wine and her food, leading to the Saturnine stupor, a chronic state of lead-induced cognitive decline, gout, and infertility that plagued the Julio-Claudian and Flavian dynasties. Beneath the shimmering silk stola of the Roman elite, the skin was not clean, but was coated in a layer of strigal sludge. Instead of soap, Romans used olive oil to lift the dirt from their bodies, which was then scraped off with the curved metal tool called a strigal. However, for a royal woman, this oil was often mixed with white lead and red ochre to maintain a pale, status-conscious complexion. When the oil was scraped away, it left behind a microscopic residue of lead and rancid fat in the folds of the skin, creating a chemical biofilm that was never fully removed. This biofilm became a breeding ground for imperial scabies, which flourished in the humid environment of the public baths. The royal woman's gown, made of translucent cone silk or heavy Egyptian linen, would cling to this oily, toxic residue, turning the garment into a moving poultice that pressed the lead deeper into her flesh throughout the day. The internal filth of the Roman empress was dominated by the apothecary of the arena. To maintain their youthful appearance and divine energy, royal women were prescribed tonics made of gladiators' blood or the charred remains of animal organs, believed to transfer the strength of the fallen to the living. This meant that the hidden filth was a literal integration of the carnage of the Colosseum into the royal gut. The breath of the empress, often smelling of the garum fermented fish sauce that was a staple of the Roman diet, was further tainted by the metallic tang of the lead in her wine. As the lead destroyed her nervous system, she would suffer from the imperial tremor and the pale wasting, her skin turning a sickly, translucent gray that no amount of red ochre could hide. This was the boring history of the Roman elite, a world where the water was a poison, the food was a heavy metal delivery system, and the very rituals of cleanliness were a slow-motion act of chemical suicide. The Roman gown was a shroud of leaden silk, concealing a body that was being dissolved by the very empire it sought to represent. The stinking laundry and the fermented rinseth, hidden filth, of the royal gown met its match in the Great Scouring, a process that took place in the damp, sunless basements of Versailles and the Louvre. Because the heavy silks, brocades, and velvets of the royal wardrobe would be destroyed by plain water, the laundresses of the Grand Common utilized a chemical substitute that was readily available and high in ammonia, stale, fermented human urine. This was the dry cleaning of the Baroque era. The gowns were draped over wooden frames while the laundresses sponged the underarm and groin areas with a mixture of aged urine and white wine vinegar. The ammonia in the urine acted as a powerful degreaser, breaking down the oils and proteins of the royal sweat, but it left behind a sharp, acrid residue that permeated the fibers. As the gown dried in the humid, unventilated laundry rooms, the smell of the urine would mingle with the metallic scent of the dyes, creating a laundress's miasma that the royal woman would carry back to the throne room. The preservation of the white linens, the chemises, and smocks worn directly against the skin involved a process called bucking. These garments were placed in large wooden tubs and covered with a layer of buck ashes, the caustic remains of burned wood mixed with lye. To whiten the fabric, the laundresses would pour boiling water over the ashes, creating a corrosive liquid that would seep through the linen, laying away at the stains, but also weakening the fibers. For the royal woman, this meant her clean undergarments were often saturated with trace amounts of caustic lye, which, when reactivated by her own perspiration during the day, would cause lye burns and chronic skin irritation across her torso. To mask the chemical and organic stench of the bucking process, the linens were then rinsed in water infused with orris root and civet musk, a glandular secretion from the civet cat. This created a cloying, animalistic scent that combined with the sharp smell of lye and the sour note of fermented urine, forming the official royal aroma that modern noses would find nauseating. The internal filth of the laundry process extended to the starching chambers. To achieve the stiff, architectural ruffs and lace cuffs required by Baroque fashion. The fabrics were dipped in a thick paste made of wheat flour and bone glue. This glue, derived from boiled hooves and hides, was a protein-rich substance that, in the heat of the palace, would begin to rot while the woman was still wearing the garment. This decomposing starch was a magnet for the palace weevil and other grain-loving insects, which would find their way into the royal woman's sleeves and collars, feasting on the glue and the flour. The boring history of the royal laundry reveals that the cleanliness of a queen was merely a different form of contamination, a chemical layer of urine, lye, and rotting animal glue that served as a foundation for her perfumes and pearls. Her gown was never truly pure. It was a recycled landscape of human waste and industrial corrosives, ensuring that her skin was in a permanent state of chemical warfare. The royal laundry was the secret factory of the hidden filth, a place where the grime of the body was traded for the stench of the vat, all to maintain the impossible illusion of a woman who was above the earth while being wrapped in its most pungent residues. Face enameling and the airtight skin in the 1860s and 70s, as the hidden filth of London's coal-choked air became unbearable, royal women turned to a radical cosmetic procedure known as enameling. This was not mere makeup, it was a structural renovation of the face. A specialized beautician would first cleanse the royal skin with alkaline spirit of wine, stripping away every natural oil until the face was raw and parched. Then, thick, paste-like ground of white lead and arsenic was smoothed over the entire face, neck, and shoulders, filling in every wrinkle and smallpox scar like plaster on a wall. To set this toxic base, a secondary layer of Venetian glass powder and bismuth was applied, which was then buffed to a high-gloss sheen. The result was a face that looked like a shimmering, unmoving mask, a divine glow that was actually an airtight seal of heavy metals. For the royal woman, this meant that for the next 2 to 3 weeks, she could not wash her face, nor could she display any strong emotion, as a single smile or frown would cause the enamel to crack like a shattered vase, requiring the entire agonizing process to be repeated. The hidden filth beneath this enamel was a biological disaster. Because the skin was completely sealed, the natural toxins, sweat, and sebum that the body needed to expel were trapped against the flesh, creating a subdermal fermentation. This led to a condition known as enamel acne, where deep, painful cysts would form beneath the lead layer. Since the royal woman could not pop or treat these sores without ruining her expensive mask, the infections would fester in the dark, anaerobic environment, leading to localized tissue necrosis, dying skin. When the enamel was finally dissolved with spirit of turpentine after several weeks, the face underneath was often a horrifying landscape of gray, pitted flesh and chemical burns. To hide this new, deeper filth, the only solution was to apply an even thicker layer of lead enamel, creating a terminal cycle of chemical mummification that slowly poisoned the woman's brain and nervous system. The internal filth was further exacerbated by the mouthwash of mercury. To keep the breath as pure as the porcelain face, royal women would rinse with blue pill solutions liquid mercury to treat the gum rot caused by their heavy metal intake. This led to the silver salivation, a chronic condition where the body attempted to purge the mercury through a constant, metallic-tasting drool. To hide this, the women would tuck scented sponges into the corners of their mouths, which would absorb the toxic saliva while releasing a cloying scent of roses. The boring history of this Victorian ritual reveals that the most admired women in the world were essentially living in a state of atmospheric suffocation, their skin unable to breathe, their mouths leaking mercury, and their blood saturated with lead. Their royal gowns, with their high, lace-choked collars, served as the structural support for these heads of lead, ensuring that the woman remained perfectly upright and perfectly still, a beautiful, decaying statue of statehood that was rotting away beneath the layer of polished, industrial glass. Face enameling and the airtight skin in the 1860s and 70s, as the hidden filth of London's coal-choked air became unbearable, royal women turned to a radical cosmetic procedure known as enameling. This was not mere makeup. It was a structural renovation of the face. A specialized beautician would first cleanse the royal skin with alkaline spirit of wine, stripping away every natural oil until the face was raw and parched. Then, thick, paste-like ground of white lead and arsenic was smoothed over the entire face, neck, and shoulders, filling in every wrinkle and smallpox scar like plaster on a wall. To set this toxic base, a secondary layer of Venetian glass powder and bismuth was applied, which was then buffed to a high-gloss sheen. The result was a face that looked like a shimmering, unmoving mask, a divine glow that was actually an airtight seal of heavy metals. For the royal woman, this meant that for the next 2 to 3 weeks, she could not wash her face, nor could she display any strong emotion, as a single smile or frown would cause the enamel to crack like a shattered vase, requiring the entire agonizing process to be repeated. The hidden filth beneath this enamel was a biological disaster. Because the skin was completely sealed, the natural toxins, sweat, and sebum that the body needed to expel were trapped against the flesh, creating a subdermal fermentation. This led to a condition known as enamel acne, where deep, painful cysts would form beneath the lead layer. Since the royal woman could not pop or treat these sores without ruining her expensive mask, the infections would fester in the dark, anaerobic environment, leading to localized tissue necrosis, dying skin. When the enamel was finally dissolved with spirit of turpentine after several weeks, the face underneath was often a horrifying landscape of gray, pitted flesh and chemical burns. To hide this new, deeper filth, the only solution was to apply an even thicker layer of lead enamel, creating a terminal cycle of chemical mummification that slowly poisoned the woman's brain and nervous system. The internal filth was further exacerbated by the mouthwash of mercury. To keep the breath as pure as the porcelain face, royal women would rinse with blue pill solutions liquid mercury to treat the gum rot caused by their heavy metal intake. This led to the silver salivation, a chronic condition where the body attempted to purge the mercury through a constant, metallic-tasting drool. To hide this, the women would tuck scented sponges into the corners of their mouths, which would absorb the toxic saliva while releasing a cloying scent of roses. The boring history of this Victorian ritual reveals that the most admired women in the world were essentially living in a state of atmospheric suffocation, their skin unable to breathe, their mouths leaking mercury, and their blood saturated with lead. Their royal gowns, with their high, lace-choked collars, served as the structural support for these heads of lead, ensuring that the woman remained perfectly upright and perfectly still, a beautiful, decaying statue of statehood that was rotting away beneath the layer of polished, industrial glass. The barber surgeons and the scouring of the blood in the 16th and 17th centuries, the hidden filth was viewed through the lens of the four humors, where any skin eruption, stench, or discoloration was seen as a sign that the blood had become corrupt or stagnant beneath the heavy gowns. The royal woman, living in a permanent state of dehydration and lead poisoning, was a prime candidate for the barber surgeon's humoral purge. To clear the skin of the lead pox caused by her makeup, the surgeon would perform a blistering ritual. This involved applying a paste made of cantharides crushed emerald beetles to the back of the neck or the inner arms. The caustic chemicals in the beetles would cause the skin to erupt in massive, weeping blisters, which were believed to draw out the internal toxins. However, because the palace air was thick with soot and the surgeon's tools were rarely cleaned of the previous patient's fluids, these blisters almost always became infected with St. Anthony's fire erysipelas, leaving the royal woman with permanent, jagged scars that she would then hide with ironically more lead-based powder. The hygiene of the limbs was managed through the leaching garter. Because the heavy, tight-laced corsets and the gown edema restricted circulation, the royal woman's legs were often swollen and dark with pooled blood. The barber surgeons would apply the physician's worm leeches to the ankles and thighs, tucking them beneath the silk stockings. As the woman sat through a 3-hour state sermon, the leeches would gorge themselves on the fermented blood, their bodies swelling to 3 times their size. When the leeches finally detached, they would leave behind Y-shaped wounds that would bleed for hours due to the anticoagulant in the leech's saliva. This blood would soak into the structural buckram of the petticoats, where it would dry and harden into a dark, metallic crust that was never washed away, contributing to the iron stench of the royal wardrobe. The boring history of this treatment reveals that the royal woman was essentially a mobile feeding ground for parasites. The fleas lived in the seams of her silk, and the leeches lived on the skin of her legs, all of them feasting on a body that was already being dissolved by lead and mercury. The internal filth was further addressed through the great cautery. For deep-seated filth or chronic vapors, surgeons would sometimes use a burning iron to create a small, permanent wound on the arm or thigh, known as an issue. A dried pea or a piece of silver wire was inserted into the wound to prevent it from healing, ensuring a constant drainage of the body's bad humors. This open, weeping sore was located directly beneath the heavy velvet sleeves of the gown, where the lack of airflow and the friction of the fabric created a permanent site of gilded gangrene. The royal woman would have to discreetly change the issue cloth, a small rag soaked in her own pus several times a day, hidden behind the tapestry of the court, while maintaining a serene and divine expression for her subjects. This was the ultimate hidden filth of the Tudor era, a body that was being intentionally kept in a state of open, infected decay, to save it from the very filth that its own fashion and medicine had created. The royal gown was not just a dress. It was a bandage, a shroud, and a cage, concealing a landscape of chemical burns, parasitic bites, and intentional wounds that defined the agonizing reality of being the most beautiful woman in the world. The secret laundry and the ritual of the urine-washed hidden filth of the royal gown met its match in the Great Scouring, a process that took place in the steaming, unventilated basements of the Grand Common at Versailles. Because the heavy silks, gold thread brocades, and delicate velvets of the royal wardrobe would be instantly ruined by plain water, the laundresses utilized a chemical substitute that was readily available and naturally high in ammonia, stale, fermented human urine. This was the dry cleaning of the Baroque era. The gowns were draped over massive wooden frames, while the laundresses sponged the underarm and groin areas with aged urine that had been allowed to sit in vats until its ammonia content peaked. The ammonia acted as a powerful degreaser, breaking down the oils and skin proteins of the royal sweat, but it left behind a sharp, acrid residue that permeated the fibers. As the gown dried in the humid basement air, the smell of the urine would bond with the metallic dyes of the fabric, creating a laundress's miasma that the royal woman would carry back to the Hall of Mirrors. The preservation of the white linens, the chemises and smocks worn directly against the skin involved a process called bucking. These garments were placed in large wooden tubs and covered with a layer of buck ashes, the caustic remains of burned wood mixed with lye. To whiten the fabric, the laundresses would pour boiling water over the ashes, creating a corrosive, alkaline liquid that seeped through the linen, eating away at the yellowed sweat stains, but also weakening the fibers. For the royal woman, this meant her clean undergarments were often saturated with trace amounts of residual lye, which, when reactivated by her own perspiration during the heat of a state ball, would cause lye burns and chronic, weeping skin irritation across her torso. To mask the chemical and organic stench of the bucking process, the linens were then rinsed in water infused with civet musk, a pungent glandular secretion from the civet cat. This created a cloying, animalistic scent that combined with the sharp smell of lye and the sour note of fermented urine, forming the official royal aroma that modern noses would find biologically repulsive. The internal filth of the laundry process extended to the starching chambers. To achieve the stiff, architectural lace cuffs and collars required by Baroque fashion, the fabrics were dipped in a thick paste made of wheat flour and bone glue. This glue, derived from boiled hooves and hides of palace livestock, was a protein-rich substance that, in the heat generated by hundreds of candles, would begin to rot while the woman was still wearing the garment. This decomposing starch was a magnet for the palace weevil and other grain-loving insects, which would migrate from the laundry rooms into the royal woman's sleeves, feasting on the glue and the flour while simultaneously biting the skin beneath. The boring history of the royal laundry reveals that the cleanliness of a queen was merely a different form of contamination, a chemical layer of urine, lye, and rotting animal glue that served as a foundation for her pearls. Her gown was never truly pure. It was a recycled landscape of human waste and industrial corrosives, ensuring that her skin was in a permanent state of chemical warfare. The royal laundry was the secret factory of the hidden filth, a place where the grime of the body was traded for the stench of the vat, all to maintain the impossible, glittering illusion of a woman who was above the earth while being wrapped in its most pungent, fermented residues. The museum Hazmat secret and the radioactive wardrobe, hidden filth, of the royal gown reaches its final, most dangerous evolution in the conservation laboratory, where the garments of the past are treated with the same protocols as toxic waste. When a 19th century royal gown or a 17th century stays enters a modern archive, it is immediately placed in chemical quarantine. This is because the poisons we have discussed, the arsenic greens, the lead whites, the mercury-laden embroideries, and the nitrobenzene blacks, do not dissipate with time. They concentrate. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the introduction of radium to create luminous lace and glowing accessories for the radium girls of the aristocracy added a new, invisible layer of filth, ionizing radiation. When a museum curator opens a sealed archival box containing a glow-in-the-dark tiara or a gown with luminescent beading, they are often met with a radon cloud that has built up inside the box over decades. Conservators must now use Geiger counters to sweep royal wardrobes, marking certain boxes with yellow radioactive stickers, ensuring that these garments are handled only by staff wearing specialized lead-lined aprons and dosimeter badges. The biological filth has also undergone a terrifying transformation into pathogenic dormancy. The skin cells, perspiration, and garment fermentation trapped in the fibers of a 200-year-old gown have dried into a microscopic dust known as archival dander. This dander contains the crystallized residues of every infection the royal woman suffered, from the bacteria of the leech fever to the spores of the palace pox. When a curator moves the gown, this dust becomes airborne, creating a pathogenic miasma that can cause immediate respiratory distress or localized heritage dermatitis in the handler. To prevent this, modern, boring history preservation requires the use of HEPA-filtered isolation chambers, where the air is scrubbed 24 times an hour to remove the invisible particles of royal decay. The shattered silk phenomenon, caused by the oxidation of heavy metal salts used to weight the dresses, creates a needle dust that is so sharp it can lacerate the lungs at a microscopic level. Handling a queen's gown today is effectively an exercise in toxic archaeology, where the beauty of the past is recognized as a direct threat to the living. The boring history of this modern reality reveals that many early 20th century museum workers suffered from mysterious wastings, which we now know were cases of chronic lead and arsenic poisoning from breathing in the hidden filth of the collections they curated. Today, the mourning crepe of the Black Widow era is treated as an acid hazard. The iron liquor dyes have become so caustic that they can literally char the archival tissue paper they rest on, a process called acid migration that mimics the slow burn of the poisons on the original royal skin. These gowns are no longer clothing. They are biochemical residue, a physical record of a time when the human body was used as a laboratory for industrial and organic filth. To view them is to witness a gilded decay, where the shimmer of the gold thread is the only thing preventing the disintegrating, toxic silk from collapsing into a pile of hazardous waste. This is the ultimate end of the boring history for sleep. The royal woman has vanished. Her palaces have crumbled, but her filth, her lead, her mercury, her arsenic, and her radiation remains perfectly preserved, a silent, lethal testament to the price of imperial vanity. The Nile's gilded parasites and the Galena mask in the courts of Nefertiti and Cleopatra. The hidden filth was centered around the eyes and the blood, where the scorching heat of the desert necessitated a form of hygiene that was actually a slow-motion act of chemical poisoning. To protect their eyes from the glare of the sun and the evil eye of desert spirits, Egyptian royal women utilized kohl, a thick, black paste made from ground galena lead sulfide and soot. While modern observers see this as a striking beauty feature, it was a biological disaster. The lead would leach through the thin skin of the eyelids, entering the ophthalmic veins and causing the pharaonic cloud, a chronic state of blurred vision, headaches, and lead-induced brain swelling. To treat the eye infections caused by the dust and the lead, the royal physicians would apply a healing ointment made of honey and ground lizard dung, which introduced ancient reptilian bacteria directly into the royal eyes, leading to a permanent state of red eye pox that the queen would hide beneath even thicker layers of black lead. The hygiene of the royal body was further compromised by the Nile sepsis. Despite their frequent ritual washings, the water of the Nile was a soup of schistosomiasis, a parasitic flatworm that entered the skin through the soles of the feet as the queen stepped into her alabaster bath. These parasites would migrate to the bladder and liver, causing the blood water fever, where the royal woman would suffer from chronic internal bleeding and a distended, painful abdomen. To hide the physical signs of this internal rot, the queen would wear gowns of semi-transparent linen, which were so fine they required constant saturation with animal fats and resins to maintain their pleats. In the 100-degree heat of the palace, these fats would turn rancid on the skin, creating a lard miasma that attracted the golden fly, a parasitic insect that would lay its eggs in the weave of the linen. The royal woman was essentially a walking incubator, her skin a landscape of lead paint and parasite entry points. Her divine scent a cloying mixture of lotus perfume and rotting animal fat. The internal filth of the Egyptian royal was dominated by the bitumen apothecary. To preserve their beauty and strength, queens would ingest mamia or ground bitumen, believed to be the blood of the earth, which was actually a toxic petroleum byproduct that led to the black lung of the Nile. Their teeth, ground down to the nerves by the fine desert sand that contaminated every loaf of bread, were fixed with bridges of gold wire and cedar resin, which trapped food particles and bacteria, leading to massive abscesses that drained the foul humor directly into the throat. This was the boring history of the Egyptian elite, a life lived in a mask of lead, with a body full of flatworms and a mouth full of gold-wrapped rot. The royal gown, for all its shimmering transparency, was merely a veil for a biological reality of such intense contamination that it required the entire complex ritual of mummification just to halt the decay that had begun while the woman was still alive. The Egyptian queen did not just die. She was chemically transitioned from a living vessel of filth to a preserved monument of lead and resin, ensuring that her hidden filth would remain a secret for 3,000 years. The ritual of the tongue and the silver scrappers in the court of Elizabeth I, the hidden filth, moved from the gown to the very source of royal speech. Because the royal diet was saturated with subtleties of pure sugar and wine stabilized with lead, the royal mouth was in a state of permanent biological collapse. The Tudor barber surgeons were tasked with the purge of the oral humors, a daily ritual where the royal tongue, often coated in a thick, white fungal growth known as the courtly fur, was violently scraped with crescent-shaped silver tools. These scrapers were designed to remove the foul effluvia of the stomach, but in reality, they often lacerated the delicate lingual papillae, creating open sores that were then exposed to the honey arsenic gargle. This was a popular medical rinse of the time, where the sweetness of the honey was used to mask a low-grade solution of arsenic intended to kill the breath stench. The result was a royal woman whose mouth was a map of chemical burns and metallic poisoning, her speech often slurred by the swelling of her own tongue. The hygiene of the teeth was equally horrific. Because black teeth were a sign of wealth, proving one could afford expensive sugar, royal women rarely sought to clean them, until the pain became unbearable. When the barber surgeon did intervene, he utilized the brick and acid polish, This involves scrubbing the teeth with a paste made of crushed brick dust and diluted sulfuric acid oil of vitriol. While this would temporarily strip away the sugar crust, it also dissolved the tooth enamel, leaving the raw nerves exposed to the freezing drafts of the palace. To seal these sensitive areas, the surgeons used mercury amalgams applied. Without any form of anesthesia, the mercury would slowly vaporize within the mouth, leading to the gilded salivation, where the royal woman would produce up to 2 quarts of toxic saliva a day. To manage this, she would wear salivation cloths, thick pads of linen tucked into her high lace ruff, which would become saturated with mercury-tainted spit, pressing a caustic, heavy metal poultice against her neck for the duration of the day. The internal filth was further compounded by the mastication of the musk ball. To hide the smell of the rotting enamel and the ammonia breath caused by lead-induced kidney failure, royal women would chew on pomander pellets made of civet musk and ground ambergris. These substances, derived from the anal glands of cats and the intestinal secretions of whales, were essentially perfumed waste. As the queen chewed, these organic residues would lodge in the cavities of her teeth, where they would begin a secondary fermentation process. The boring history of the Tudor mouth reveals that the divine voice of the monarch was actually issuing from a throat raw with acid burns, a tongue weeping from silver scrapers, and a jawbone that was slowly being softened by mercury. Her royal gown, with its stiffened collar and shimmering pearls, was the only thing holding her head upright as her internal skeletal structure crumbled under the weight of heroic medicine. This was the ultimate hidden filth, a world where a single royal kiss was a lethal dose of heavy metals and ancient bacteria, and where the regal smile was a display of blackening bone and chemical trauma, the toxic tooth, and the bioarchival gravy. In the laboratories of the 21st century, the hidden filth of the royal woman has become a molecular crime scene. When a royal tomb is opened for conservation, or when a set of dental remains from a 17th century queen is analyzed, researchers do not wear white coats, they wear level 4 biohazard suits. This is because the heroic medicine we discussed, the mercury amalgams, the lead-based rinses, and the arsenic gargles has not dissipated. It has sequestered itself in the hydroxyapatite of the teeth, creating a time capsule of poison. A single royal molar can contain concentrations of mercury so high that it off-gasses toxic vapors the moment it is removed from its anaerobic environment. Scientists using laser ablation to track the layers of lead in a royal tooth have discovered that the lead spikes in the enamel often correspond with the dates of major state ceremonies, revealing that the queen was topping up her toxic makeup to a lethal degree for every public appearance. The hidden filth has also migrated into the archival bioaerosols. When museum conservators vacuum a royal gown from the stinking Sun King's era, the dust collected in the HEPA filters is a concentrated powder of lead carbonate and pathogenic DNA. Researchers have found that the palace sludge trapped in the hems of these gowns still contains the genetic signatures of 300-year-old bacteria, including dormant spores of Yersinia pestis, the plague, and Staphylococcus aureus. This heritage dust is so chemically and biologically volatile that it must be stored in specialized, negative-pressure archives. The boring history of modern conservation reveals that the very act of cleaning a historical gown for display can release a toxic cloud of 18th-century skin cells and 19th-century arsenic, requiring the laboratory to be evacuated. The shattered silk fibers, impregnated with metallic salts, act like needles of lead, which, if inhaled, can stay in the lungs for decades, causing a slow-motion poisoning of the modern researcher. The internal filth of the royal afterlife is now managed through radiocarbon and isotope containment. Because the royal women consumed so much mumia, ground bitumen, and king's drops human bone spirits, their skeletal remains are often chemically anomalous, showing isotope levels that don't match the local environment. This chemical mummification has created a situation where the royal body is a permanent environmental hazard. If buried in standard soil, the lead and mercury from a single queen could contaminate the local water table for centuries. Modern Museums and cathedrals now use lead-lined vaults and argon gas environments to store these remains, effectively keeping the hidden filth in a state of permanent stasis. This is the ultimate end of the boring history for sleep. The royal woman's quest for eternal beauty has resulted in a literal, radioactive eternity, where her body, her teeth, and her gowns are so contaminated by the filth of her own era that they can never truly return to the earth. She remains a prisoner of her own finery, a biohazard empress whose secret rot is now the most carefully guarded and dangerous data in the modern world. The portable miasma and the floating cesspool, hidden filth, of the great explorers began in the cramped, airless cabins of vessels like the HMS Endeavour or the Santa Maria, where the concept of hygiene was sacrificed to the mechanical demands of survival. For a high-ranking woman accompanying a colonial expedition or a governor's wife traveling to the East Indies, her gown became a biological time capsule. Because fresh water was reserved for drinking, it was strictly forbidden to wash clothing during a 4-month voyage. This meant that the silk and wool gowns of the elite travelers became saturated with a maritime sludge, a mixture of sea salt, ship's grease, livestock dander from the onboard pens, and the unwashed oils of the human body. As the ship crossed the humid doldrums of the equator, the garment fermentation process reached a fever pitch. The moisture in the air combined with the salt in the fabric to create a permanent, damp brine rot that ate away at the silk fibers while trapping bacteria against the skin. The internal filth of the expedition was dominated by ship's scurvy and the putrid gums. Because the diet consisted of salt horse, preserved beef, and hardtack biscuits infested with weevils, the royal or noble explorer suffered from a total collapse of connective tissue. Their gums would soften and bleed, and old wounds, some from the barber surgeon treatments of years prior, would spontaneously reopen. To combat the foul air of the ship's hold, which smelled of bilge water and rotting timber, the travelers would douse their gowns in spirit of camphor and tobacco water. This created a cloying, medicinal stench that the local populations of the Americas and the Pacific would later describe as the scent of the ghost people, smell of decay and chemicals that preceded the explorers wherever they landed. The gowns, with their internal structures of whalebone and buckram, became parasitic lifeboats for European lice and bedbugs, which were introduced to indigenous populations who had no natural immunity to these gilded pests. The boring history of these encounters reveals that the discovery of the New World was actually a massive, unwashed exchange of filth. As the explorer stepped onto a pristine beach in Tahiti or the Caribbean, her gown dragging through the sand and the tide released a microbial wave of 18th-century European pathogens into the environment. The hidden filth was now a global export. The explorer was not just a mapmaker. She was a mobile biochemical reactor, her body a slurry of lead poisoning, scurvy-induced rot, and maritime parasites, all concealed beneath the fraying, salt-stained remains of a Parisian gown. This was the ultimate expansion of the royal rot, a world where the divine right to explore was synonymous with the right to contaminate, and where the most beautiful fabrics in the world became the primary carriers for the end of the old world, and the toxic birth of the new. The orbital odors and the zero-G biofilm in the early days of Project Mercury, Gemini, and the Soviet Vostok missions. The hidden filth of the astronaut was a matter of atmospheric stagnation. Because the early capsules were roughly the size of a telephone booth and lacked any form of bathing facilities, the space gown, the multi-layered pressure suit, became a mobile environment for concentrated organic decay. For a mission lasting several days, the astronaut was sealed into a garment made of nylon, aluminized mylar, and rubber, which acted as a biological pressure cooker. In the absence of gravity, sweat does not run off the skin. Instead, it forms a thick, gelatinous, zero-G biofilm that coats the entire body. This film, a mixture of salt, skin oils, and exfoliated cells, becomes a breeding ground for orbital fungi that thrive in the 100% oxygen environments of the early NASA cabins. The internal filth of the spacecraft was dominated by the recycled miasma Because the life support systems were designed to scrub carbon dioxide but were less efficient at removing volatile organic compounds, VOCs, the smell of the cabin became a legendary horror among ground crews who opened the hatches upon splashdown. This scent, described by technicians as a mixture of burnt gunpowder, wet dog, and raw sewage, was the result of the body's inability to shed its waste in a confined space. Without a garderobe or a staircase corner, early astronauts utilized fecal containment bags and urine collection devices that frequently leaked in the weightless environment. These floating pathogens would then be sucked into the ventilation fans and redistributed across the instrument panels and into the fabrics of the flight suits, ensuring that the divine explorer of the heavens was literally breathing in their own recycled excrement for the duration of the flight. The boring history of the early space race reveals that the hero of the heavens was often suffering from a form of orbital dermatitis caused by the constant friction of the sweat-soaked biofilm against the rubber lining of the suit. This resulted in suit sores, painful, weeping lesions on the shoulders and groin that were remarkably similar to the curdle ulcers of the Middle Ages. Upon returning to Earth, the hidden filth of the astronaut was so concentrated that the recovery teams often wore gas masks to avoid the overwhelming stench of the cabin. This was the ultimate evolution of the gilded cage. The silk and whalebone of the Victorian Queen had been replaced by Teflon and beta cloth, but the human body inside remained a vessel of rot, proving that even in the stars, we cannot escape the hidden filth of our own biological existence. The spacesuit was the final gown, a high-tech shroud that protected the explorer from the vacuum of space, while trapping them in the vacuum of their own decay. The night soil men and the liquid labyrinth in the mid-19th century, before the Great Stink of 1858 forced the construction of Bazalgette's intercepting sewers, London was a city floating on a cesspool crust. The hidden filth was managed by a class of laborers known as the night soil men. These men operated in the dead of night, descending into the brick-lined cesspits beneath the floorboards of aristocratic townhouses to manually shovel out the accumulated waste of the upper classes. Because the air in these pits was saturated with hydrogen sulfide and methane, the work was a constant dance with the sudden death. A single spark from a lantern could ignite the gutter gas, turning the cesspit into a subterranean bomb, while a high concentration of the gas could blind a man in seconds, a condition known in the trade as the sewer eye. The night soil men wore fustian jackets, heavy, coarse cotton saturated with linseed oil and coal tar to prevent the liquid waste from soaking into their skin, creating a waterproof but suffocating sludge armor that smelled worse than the pits they cleaned. The boring history of this labor reveals a terrifying biological reality. The hidden filth of the Victorian elite, the lead from their makeup, the arsenic from their gowns, and the pathogens from their gilded gut, all ended up in the shovels of these men. As they worked, the aerosolized waste would settle into their lungs, leading to the sewer wasting, a form of chronic pulmonary infection and heavy metal poisoning that turned their skin a telltale effluvia gray. Beneath the city, the Toshers sewer hunters scoured the flowing tunnels for tosh, bits of scrap metal, silver spoons, or coins that had slipped through the floorboards of the rich. These men lived in a state of permanent dermal saturation, their bodies becoming so accustomed to the ammonia and bacteria of the sewer that their immune systems were in a constant, hyper-aggressive state of war. They were the shadow royals of the filth, navigating a liquid labyrinth where the walls were coated in fatbergs, massive, solid concretion of human fat, lime, and alkaline soaps that had been flushed away by the refined women of the surface. The internal filth of the Victorian sewer was further complicated by the industrial leachate. The tanneries and chemical works of London dumped their waste mercury, sulfuric acid, and chromium directly into the same tunnels where the Toshers worked. This meant that the hidden filth was a chemical soup that could dissolve the leather boots of a workman in a single shift. To protect their feet, the men would wrap their legs in pitch rags, linen soaked in hot tar, which would bond to their skin and could only be removed by scraping with a knife. The boring history of the sewers reveals that the grandeur of the empire was physically supported by a foundation of congealed human fat and toxic sludge, maintained by a class of men who were the primary filters for the city's biological reality. Their lives were the graveside of the royal gown. For every yard of shimmering silk worn in the ballroom, there was a gallon of toxic byproduct waiting for a night soil man in the dark. This was the ultimate hidden filth, not a secret kept behind a corset, but a massive, subterranean world of rot that functioned as the dark, pulsing heart of the modern world, proving that the more civilized a society claims to be, the more complex and lethal its waste management becomes. The lizard dung eye mask and the galena gazine, the scorching heat of the new kingdom. The hidden filth was centered around the most sacred part of the royal body, the eyes. The Egyptian queen did not just wear makeup, she wore a leaden shield to combat the blinding glare of the desert and the constant threat of Nile blight trachoma. The queen's eyes were rimmed with kohl, a thick, jet-black paste composed of ground galena lead sulfide, malachite, and animal fat. While this served as a primitive sunglass, it was a biological catastrophe. The lead was absorbed through the thin mucous membranes of the eye, entering the bloodstream and traveling directly to the brain. This caused the imperial lethargy, a chronic state of lead-induced cognitive decline, tremors, and a permanent metallic taste in the mouth. When the eyes inevitably became inflamed from the lead and the blowing desert sand, the royal physicians applied the reptilian poultice. This was a mixture of honey, ground lizard dung, and fermented milk, applied directly to the eyelids. The ammonia in the dung acted as a caustic cleanser, while the bacteria from the lizard excrement introduced ancient, zoonotic infections into the queen's tear ducts, leading to a permanent, weeping pharaonic crust that was hidden beneath even thicker layers of black lead. The hygiene of the royal skin was governed by the bitumen barrier. Because the Nile was a source of both life and parasitic death, royal women avoided plain water. Instead, they washed with natron, a natural salt, and anointed themselves with a thick layer of mamiya, bitumen mixed with cedar oil. This created a waterproof, tar-like seal on the skin that was intended to repel the schistosoma parasites of the river. However, this seal acted as an atmospheric trap, sealing the queen's sweat and skin oils beneath a layer of petroleum byproduct. In the 110-degree heat of the palace at Thebes, this gilded tar would begin to soften and go rancid, attracting the Nile blowfly, which would lay its eggs in the creases of the queen's skin, particularly in the folds of the neck and the armpits. The queen's divine glow was, in reality, a sticky, dark film of tar and dead insects, which could only be removed by scraping the skin with curved obsidian knives, a process that left the body covered in microscopic lacerations that were then sealed with more lead-based pigments. The internal filth of the Egyptian elite was a masterpiece of gilded gastritis. To maintain the purity of the ka, the queen consumed bread that was 10% desert sand, a byproduct of the grinding stones. This sand acted as a permanent abrasive, wearing the royal teeth down to the raw pulps by the age of 25. To hide the blackened nerves and the stench of dental abscesses, the queen's mouth was packed with frankincense and myrrh resin, which acted as a biological plug. However, this resin trapped the anaerobic bacteria of the mouth, leading to the bone rot of the jaw, where the infection would eventually eat through the jawbone and drain into the throat. The boring history of the pharaohs reveals that the eternal beauty seen in their statues was a desperate, chemical mask for a living reality of lead poisoning, parasitic infection, and skeletal collapse. The royal gown of pleated linen was not just a garment, it was a white, pristine shroud worn by a woman who was already, chemically and biologically, halfway to the tomb, her body a vessel for the very resins and metals that would eventually be used to mummify her. The Gilded Feast and the Great Kitchen wrote in the 17th century court of Versailles. The hidden filth reached its peak in the office of the mouth. While the king and his queen sat in the hall of mirrors, their food was being prepared in a subterranean world of heat, dampness, and unmanaged waste. Because the kitchens were located hundreds of yards from the dining halls to prevent the base odors of cooking from reaching the royal nose, the food massive platters of peacock, venison, and cream-heavy sauces had to be carried through long, drafty corridors. During this transit, the gilded steam of the food acted as a magnet for the palace bioaerosol, a mixture of coal soot, lead dust from the walls, and the miasmic vapors of the unwashed courtiers. By the time the queen took her first bite, the surface of her meal was coated in a fine layer of 17th-century industrial and biological waste. The hygiene of the preparation was equally horrific. The kitchen staff, often numbering in the hundreds, lived in the same damp cellars where they worked. Because there was no running water, the copper pots were cleaned with sand and stale urine, leaving a metallic, acidic residue that leached into the sauces. This led to the verdigris poisoning, where the royal family consumed trace amounts of copper acetate with every meal, causing chronic green vomiting and intestinal cramping. To mask the taste of the copper rot and the meat that had begun to turn during its long transit, the chefs used excessive amounts of nutmeg and lead-sweetened wine. This created an internal chemical sludge in the royal gut. The lead settled in the bones, while the high-fat content of the sauces caused a permanent state of biliary stagnation, or gallstones, which the royal physicians attempted to treat by prescribing spirit of human skull ground bone mixed into the queen's chocolate. The internal filth of the royal feast culminated in the Great Tapeworm Gala. Because the grand style required meat to be served in massive, often undercooked roasts, the royal family was a primary host for Taenia solium. These parasites would grow to lengths of 20 feet within the royal digestive tract, competing with the queen for nutrients and causing her to suffer from the gilded wasting, a state of permanent hunger and emaciation despite her decadent diet. To hide the physical effects of this internal filth, the bloating, the pale skin, and the lethargy, the queen was forced into even tighter corsets and thicker layers of lead makeup, creating a lethal pressure cooker environment for her struggling organs. The boring history of the Versailles kitchen reveals that the magnificence of France was built on a foundation of rotting meat, copper poisoning, and parasitic infestation, proving that the more elaborate the ritual of the feast, the more efficient it was at delivering the hidden filth directly into the royal bloodstream. The toxic feast and the molecular ghost in the high-security laboratories of the Louvre and the British Museum. The hidden filth of the royal feast is analyzed using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry (ICP) (MIS). When a silver chalice or a ceramic plate from a royal burial is recovered, it is not washed. It is swabbed for pathogenic biofilms. Scientists have discovered that the porous surfaces of 17th-century pottery act as a time capsule for the very bacteria that plagued the Versailles kitchens. A single microscopic fragment of residue can contain the dormant DNA of Salmonella typhi and Listeria, preserved in a matrix of leaded wine and animal fats. Because these pathogens can survive in a desiccated state for centuries, the lab technicians must handle these shards of history in Class 3 biosafety cabinets, wearing pressurized suits to prevent the accidental inhalation of a Baroque bioaerosol. The hidden filth has also been found to be isotopically permanent. By analyzing the stable isotopes in the hair and bone of royal remains, researchers can reconstruct every toxic meal the queen ever ate. The verdigris poisoning from the copper pots leaves a distinct copper-65 signature in the hair shafts, while the lead from the sweetened wine creates a lead-206 spike in the dental enamel that never fades. This means that the divine body is essentially a toxic barcode. When a royal body is exhumed for study, the concentration of heavy metals is often so high that the bones are technically classified as mixed hazardous waste. In some cases, the mercury used in heroic medicine has leached into the surrounding soil of the crypt, creating a mercury plume that requires the entire burial chamber to be treated as a Superfund site before historians can even begin their work. The boring history of this modern forensic reality reveals a terrifying truth. The hidden filth was not a temporary state of the past, but a permanent chemical legacy. The grandeur of the empire has left a molecular ghost that modern science is only now beginning to quantify. The royal dinnerware is no longer a symbol of hospitality, but a leachate source. The gowns we discussed earlier are now known to have off-gassed their toxins into the very plates the royals ate from, creating a feedback loop of contamination. This concludes our 10 word per part immersion into the hidden filth. We have seen the rot in the seams, the lead on the skin, the parasites in the gut, and the radiation in the archive. The history of the elite is not written in gold, but in the enduring, toxic residues of their own magnificent, unwashed existence, a story that can only be safely told through a layer of leaded glass, an HEPA filter. The Great Stink and the Fermenting Riverbee. The summer of 1858, London's hidden filth was no longer hidden. It had become an atmospheric monster. For centuries, the city had relied on a chaotic system of cesspools and medieval drains that emptied directly into the River Thames. However, with the introduction of the water closet, the flush toilet, the volume of liquid waste increased exponentially. The hidden filth of the Victorian elite, the leaden makeup, the arsenic dyes, and the human waste of the palaces was flushed away and diverted into a river that had reached its breaking point. During an unusually hot July, the Thames ceased to be a river and became a 15-mile fermenting septic tank. The heat caused the palace sludge and gutter grime to rise to the surface in massive, bubbling rafts of methane and organic decay, releasing a stench so powerful it was said to be audible to the nose. The boring history of this event reveals a terrifying biological reality. The air in the Houses of Parliament, located directly on the riverbank, became so toxic that the windows were draped in lime-soaked canvas to prevent the miasmic vapors from sickening the lawmakers. This canvas, intended to act as a chemical filter, would quickly turn a putrid gray as it absorbed the airborne particles of the city's waste. Within the palace, the hidden filth was everywhere. The very curtains and upholstery absorbed the sewer gas, turning the interior of the government into a secondary cesspool. The elite, who had spent decades masking their own body odors with perfumes, were now trapped in a collective, city-wide stench that no amount of violet water could hide. This was the ultimate social leveler. The filth of the night soilmen and the filth of the queen were now one and the same, swirling together in the thick, brown fog of the Thames. The internal filth of the Great Stink was dominated by the cholera ghost. Because the city's drinking water was still being drawn from the same river where the waste was dumped, the hidden filth was being pumped directly back into the homes of the wealthy. The microbial loop was complete. As the elite sat in their velvet-lined parlors, they were consuming the diluted effluvia of the entire population. This led to a state of systemic dysentery that affected even the highest ranks of society, turning the divine body into a vessel for the waterborne pathogens of the slum. The Great Stink was not just a nuisance. It was a biological siege that proved that no wall, no gown, and no amount of lead makeup could protect the aristocracy from the consequences of their own unmanaged waste. It forced the birth of the sanitary revolution, leading to the construction of the massive, brick-lined sewers we discussed earlier, a project that was essentially an attempt to bury the hidden filth so deep that it could never again rise to threaten the nostrils of the empire. The leech garter and the humoral vacuum. In the 16th century, the hidden filth was believed to reside in the superfluous humors of the blood. Because the royal woman was encased in a corset that restricted her breathing and a gown that weighed up to 40 pounds, her circulation was in a state of permanent stagnation. This led to the gilded edema, a swelling of the ankles and thighs that turned the skin a sickly, mottled purple. To cleanse this internal filth, the barber surgeons employed the leeching ritual. Instead of a simple bath, the royal woman would have dozens of medicinal leeches, Hirudo medicinalis, applied to her inner thighs, held in place by a specialized leech garter made of perforated silk. As she sat through grueling court ceremonies, the leeches would drain up to 10 times their body weight in corrupt blood, their rhythmic pulsing hidden beneath her velvet skirts. The boring history of this practice reveals a terrifying biological exchange. The leeches, often kept in jars of stagnant water, would frequently regurgitate the bacteria of their previous meals or the toxins of the water into the royal bloodstream. This introduced sepsis of the garter, a chronic, localized infection that caused the woman's legs to weep a clear, yellowish fluid known as serous waste. This fluid would soak into the structural buckram and whalebone of her farthingale, where it would dry into a stiff, salt-encrusted layer. Because the gown was never laundered, this biocrust became a permanent part of the garment's anatomy. The smell, a mixture of metallic blood and souring infection, was so potent that it was the primary reason for the invention of the pomander knee ring, a sachet of cloves and musk worn just above the leech garter to mask the scent of the woman's own parasitic cleansing. The internal filth was further managed through the silver lancet purge. For more acute filth, such as the headaches caused by lead makeup or the vapors of sugar-induced tooth rot, the surgeon would open the cephalic vein in the arm. The blood was collected in a bleeding bowl made of pewter or silver. The surgeons would observe the crust that formed on the surface of the cooling blood. If it was yellow or greasy, it was proof of the hidden filth of her diet. To balance the loss of blood, the woman was then fed viper broth or spirit of raw silk, substances believed to thicken the remaining blood, but which actually introduced more heavy metals and organic toxins into her system. The result was a royal woman who was perpetually anemic, her skin turning the very death-pale color she tried to achieve with lead makeup, not because of the paint, but because her life force was being systematically drained into the seams of her own dress. The molecular vampire and the blood fiber secrete, hidden filth, of a royal gown reaches its ultimate scientific resolution in the genomic sequencing lab. When a Tudor-era velvet gown or a Stuart-era silk bodice is acquired by a museum, the seams are examined under UV fluorescence. This light reveals the ghosts of the garter, the ancient, invisible splatters of blood left behind by the barber surgeon's leeches. Because blood binds to natural fibers like silk and wool at a molecular level, it becomes a biochemical time capsule. Using a process called microswabbing, scientists can extract 500-year-old DNA from these stains. They aren't just finding the queen's DNA, they are finding the DNA of the parasites. By sequencing the genetic material found in a single blood stain on a royal hem, researchers have identified the specific strains of Yersinia pestis and Staphylococcus that were circulating in the royal bloodstream while the woman was dancing. In the Hall of Mirrors, the hidden filth is also analyzed through proteomics, the study of ancient proteins. The biocrust we discussed, the mixture of sweat, lead makeup, and serous fluid from leech wounds, has a unique protein signature. By analyzing the heavy metal binding in these proteins, scientists can determine the exact brand of Venetian ceruse lead makeup the queen used and how deeply it had penetrated her skin. This dust is so toxic that the analysis must be performed in glove boxes with specialized filtration. The boring history of this forensic work reveals that the divine glow of the royal portrait was actually a state of systemic inflammatory response syndrome. Sirs, the hidden filth trapped in the gown's fibers proves that the royal woman was in a state of constant, low-grade sepsis, her body fighting off the very cures intended to save her. The internal filth of the royal afterlife is now managed through molecular containment. Because the DNA in these gowns is so well preserved by the lead and mercury, which act as accidental biocides, the garments are technically biological data centers. Modern archives now store these items in anoxic oxygen-free nitrogen chambers to prevent the DNA from degrading. This creates a frozen history where the filth never truly dies. The boring history of the museum reveals that we are no longer just looking at a dress. We are looking at a biohazardous hard drive containing the entire medical history of the monarchy. The royal woman's quest for immortality has been achieved, but not through her deeds, rather through the permanent, toxic, and genetically readable record of her own unwashed existence, held in stasis by the very poisons that defined her life. The copper-cankered cauldrons and the verdigris stew in the bowels of the palace. Beneath the glittering parquet of the state apartments lay the gilded inferno, the Great Kitchens. Here, the hidden filth was born from the chemical reaction between high-fashion luxury and primitive sanitation. The primary vessels for the royal meal were massive, unlined copper cauldrons, while the nobility demanded complex, slow-simmered ragouts and acidic wine-based sauces. These very ingredients acted as a solvent on the copper. Because the kitchens lacked running water and utilized dry scouring with sand and stale urine, a thick, toxic layer of verdigris copper acetate would form on the internal surfaces of the pots. This green rot was often mistaken for a seasoning by the overworked, soot-blinded cooks. When the queen's soup of the day was served, it was essentially a liquid infusion of copper ions, leading to the palace colic, a chronic state of vomiting, metallic-tasting saliva, and a greenish tint to the whites of the royal eyes. The hygiene of the gilded feast was further compromised by the draft of the dam. Because the kitchens were located in the dampest, lowest levels of the palace to hide the base labor from the king, the food was prepared in an environment of constant condensation. This moisture mixed with the soot from the massive hearths to create a greasewood rain that fell from the rafters directly into the uncovered serving platters. To clean the soot from the food, the servants would simply glaze the meat with thickened lard and bone glue, which trapped the industrial particles against the flesh. By the time the meal reached the royal table after a 10-minute walk through the drafty, unwashed corridors, it had reached the perfect temperature for bacterial bloom. The hidden filth of the royal gut was a direct result of this cold transit, where the meat already aged to the point of high scent became a breeding ground for salmonella and clostridium, ensuring that the royal digestive system was in a state of permanent, agonizing revolt. The internal filth reached its most magnificent state in the sugar sculptures Le Grand Palais. These centerpiece displays were made of sugar, egg whites, and bone-black charred animal bones for pigment. Because they were intended for display rather than immediate consumption, they would sit in the humid palace air for days, absorbing the miasmic vapors of the unwashed courtiers and attracting swarms of palace flies. When the queen finally broke off a piece of the gilded tower to eat, she was consuming a compressed block of dust, insect waste, and old egg protein. This led to the sugared wasting, where the royal woman suffered from chronic fermentation of the stomach, her breath smelling of sour wine and rotting eggs, a stench she would then attempt to hide with the ambergris and lead poison powders we discussed in part 1. This was the boring history of the royal feast, a cycle of ingestion where the divine was fueled by the decayed, and where the most sophisticated court in Europe was essentially feeding itself on a diet of copper rot and sweetened waste.